The 9-year-old girl's heart monitor flatlined at 3:47 a.m. For 6 seconds, Emma Vasquez was clinically dead. Then a stranger's heart kicked in her chest, violent, furious, refusing to quit, as if it remembered other battles, other refusals, to surrender. Dr. Sarah Chen would later call it the most aggressive transplant recovery she'd ever witnessed. The heart didn't just beat, it fought, like it was still at war. 3 floors down, in the hospital morgue, lay the body of Sergeant Michael Torres, 28 years old, chest cavity empty, brain tumor intact. His final donation complete. The nurse who prepared his body for burial found the note taped to his dog tags. Tell her the heart has seen Kharkiv's snow and mortar fire. It knows how to survive. It will teach her. But survival, Emma would learn, was only the beginning of Michael Torres' last mission. Before I go on, write the word heart if you are a sensitive and kind person. Thank you. 6 months earlier, Michael had sat in a sterile room at Walter Reed Medical Center, processing words that didn't make sense. The shrapnel wound from Kharkiv was healing fine. A minor injury, they'd said. Lucky considering what could have happened when that building collapsed. Glioblastoma multiforme, Dr. Richards repeated gently. Grade 4. The scans show multiple sites. From the injury? No. This was already there. The injury just led us to find it. Michael stared at the images of his brain, white spots like stars against the dark. Beautiful almost if they weren't a death sentence. How long? With aggressive treatment, possibly 8 months. Without. The doctor's pause was answer enough. And my body? The rest of me? Dr. Richards pulled up additional scans. Remarkably healthy. Your heart is exceptional, athlete-level conditioning. Liver, kidneys, all optimal. It's just my brain that's dying. Michael finished the sentence with soldier's directness. Everything else is combat ready. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. Not from fear. He'd made peace with death in Ukraine. What haunted him was waste. A healthy body that would be buried with its broken brain. Organs that could save lives, rotting in the ground. He thought of Anya, 7 years old, caught in the crossfire during the battle for Kharkiv. He'd carried her to the medical tent, her small body torn by shrapnel, her eyes already seeing beyond this world. Will it hurt? She'd asked in Ukrainian. No, Solnishko. Like going to sleep. Will you remember me? Always. She died holding his hand. Her mother arrived too late, collapsing over the small body. Through her sobs, one phrase repeated, make it mean something. Please. Make her death mean something. He couldn't. Not then. But now, Michael opened his laptop, started researching living organ donation, compatibility requirements, waiting lists. By dawn, he had a plan. The first name on his list was Maria Rodriguez, 7 years old. Kidney failure from contaminated water in her family's old apartment building. The landlord had known about the lead pipes, had painted over the rust, raised the rent, and ignored complaints until children started getting sick. Michael found her at Children's Hospital during dialysis. She was reading a book about dolphins, tubes running from her thin arm to the machine that did what her kidneys couldn't. Excuse me, he said from the doorway. Mind if I sit? Maria's mother, Rosa, looked up warily. Hospital waiting rooms taught parents to guard their space, their hope, their children. I'm Sergeant Torres. I volunteer here. Read to the kids sometimes. Recognition flickered. You're the soldier with the funny voices. Maria's mentioned you. Guilty. As charged. Michael smiled at the girl. What chapter are we on? The dolphins are helping the lost swimmer, Maria said without looking up. They're bringing her to shore. Smart dolphins, always helping when someone's in trouble. Maria finally met his eyes. Old eyes in a young face. Are you in trouble? The directness of children never ceased to amaze him. A little, but I might be able to help you with yours. Rosa's hand tightened on her daughter's shoulder. What do you mean? I understand Maria needs a kidney. I happen to have two. Only need one. The book slipped from Maria's hands. You want to give me your kidney? Lend it to you. Take good care of it for me. But why? You don't know us. Michael thought of Anya, of promises made to grieving mothers, of debts that couldn't be paid but could be passed forward. Because I can. Because you need it. Because... He paused, choosing his words. Because every soldier needs a mission. Helping you is mine. Rosa began to cry. Not the desperate tears of hospital hallways, but the kind that come when hope arrives. Unexpected, we can't pay. I'm not selling, I'm serving. The testing began immediately. Blood types matched, tissue compatibility confirmed. Michael passed every psychological evaluation. The doctors found his reasoning sound, his commitment unshakable. You understand the risks? Dr. Chen asked during final consultation. I understand the alternative. Maria dies waiting. I die regardless. Simple math. It's not that simple. It is if you make it so. The surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday. Michael spent Monday with Maria, reading her dolphin book cover to cover, teaching her Ukrainian phrases, showing her pictures from better times, snow-covered streets, golden church domes, children playing in Independence Square before the war came. What's Ukraine like? Maria asked. Cold, beautiful, brave. Like you? Like you. She held his hand as they wheeled him to surgery. I'll take good care of it, she promised. Your kidney, and when I see the ocean, I'll tell the dolphins about you. Deal. Michael woke to find a crayon drawing taped to his IV pole. Stick figures on a beach, a girl and a soldier, holding hands by the waves. Thank you for the loan, Maria, written in careful cursive. 3 weeks later, she was off dialysis, running, playing, being 7 instead of being sick, 1 down, 22 to go. David Park was next, 11 years old, liver failing from a medication, error when he was an infant. The hospital had settled out of court, but the money was long gone. Medical bills had a way of devouring settlements like cancer devoured cells. Michael found him in the music room, hands poised over piano keys he couldn't press. The effort of sitting upright was almost too much. Chopin? Michael asked. The boy startled. You know it? Waltz in C-sharp minor. My grandmother's favorite, she survived the camps. Said Chopin kept her human when the world tried to make her otherwise. David's eyes widened. My grandmother says the same. Different camps. Korean War. Music survives when we don't. Carries. Forward what matters. I can't play anymore. Too tired. The doctors say after the transplant, if I get one, the medications might what? Make me forget. How to play. How to feel the music. Michael sat beside him on the bench. His own fingers found the keys, clumsy but determined. The melody was rough, imperfect, but recognizable. I'm no pianist, he said. But the music's still there, in my head, in my hands. It survives. Play something else. So Michael did. Simple pieces his grandmother had taught him. Ukrainian folk songs. American hymns learned in boot camp. David listened with the intensity of someone memorizing a roadmap home. Will you really give me part of your liver? Already being tested for compatibility. But why me? There are other kids, all getting help if I can manage it, but you're next because... Michael considered. Because music matters. Because the world needs pianists more than it needs soldiers. Because my grandmother would haunt me if I let talent die for want of an organ. David laughed, a sound like music itself. She sounds scary, terrifying. Survived Stalin, Hitler, and my grandfather. Said the piano was her weapon against darkness. Mine too. The surgery took 6 hours. Michael's liver, healthy and strong, regenerated quickly. David's body accepted the gift like an instrument accepting its missing strings. A week later, weak but determined, David played his first post-surgery concert, just for Michael. Chopin's waltz, note perfect, tears streaming down both their faces. for my donor, David whispered. Until I can play Carnegie Hall. You will, Michael promised. You will. The hardest was Tommy Chen, 5 years old, leukemia, requiring bone marrow transplant. Same age as Anya, Michael almost couldn't enter the room. The memories were too sharp. Another small body fighting a losing battle, another mother keeping hopeless vigil. But Tommy's laughter drew him in. The boy was coloring, tongue stuck out in concentration, completely absorbed in his art. That's quite a dragon, Michael offered. Tommy looked up. Bald head, hollow cheeks, eyes that sparkled with stubborn life. It's fighting the cancer monster. See, the red things are bad cells. The dragon burns them up. Smart dragon. Does he have a name? Sergeant Flameheart. Like you, the nurses said you're a sergeant. I am, and I fight monsters too. Really? Tommy's eyes widened. What kind? All kinds. Big ones with guns. Sneaky ones that hide. Mean ones that hurt kids. Did you win? Sometimes. Not always. But I always tried. Tommy returned to his coloring, then suddenly asked, Am I going to die? The question hit like shrapnel. Michael knelt, beside the bed. What makes you ask that? Mom cries when she thinks I'm sleeping. The doctors whisper. And Sarah, she was in the next room. She went to heaven last week. Michael studied this 5-year-old warrior. Decided he deserved a warrior's truth. I don't know, nobody does, but I know you're fighting hard and sometimes fighters get reinforcements. What's reinforcements? Backup. Help, like when the good guys are losing and suddenly more good guys show up. Like in movies? Exactly. And guess what? I'm your reinforcement. Tommy's forehead wrinkled. How? My bone marrow might work in your body. Help you make good cells to fight the bad ones. Want to team up? You mean share? Like toys? Better than toys. Like sharing superpowers. Tommy considered this with 5-year-old gravity. Okay, but you have to promise something. What's that? If I don't make it, you'll remember me, like really remember, not just sad remember. Another echo of Anya. Another small hand reaching across the void. I promise, but you know what? You're going to make it. Know how I know? How? Because dragons don't give up, and neither do sergeants. The marrow extraction was more painful than Michael had expected. But 2 weeks later, Tommy's counts began improving. The boy sent drawings daily, the dragon growing stronger, the monster shrinking, and always 2 figures standing together. A soldier and a small boy with a sword too big for his hands. That's us, Tommy explained during a visit. Battle buddies. The best kind. Sergeant Mike? Tommy's voice grew serious. If I grow up, I want to be like you. When you grow up, Michael corrected. And you'll be better. The twins, Sarah and Samuel Washington, were a different kind of challenge. 8 years old. Sickle cell disease. Not terminal, but crisis after crisis wore them down like water on stone. Michael met them during one of their pain episodes. They lay in adjacent beds, hands stretched across the gap, fingers intertwined. Their mother Denise sat between them, singing softly, a hymn Michael recognized from his grandmother's church. May I? He asked from the doorway. Denise looked up, eyes red-rimmed but wary. You're the reading soldier, Michael Torres. And yes, guilty as charged. The children enjoy your visits when they're well enough. He entered slowly, respecting the sacred space of a mother guarding her cubs. I might be able to help, more than just reading. How? Blood donations, plasma, regular transfusions can reduce crisis frequency. I'm O negative. Universal donor. The blood bank has shortages, always, but I don't. Samuel stirred. Mom? Who's that? The story soldier baby. Rest now. It hurts, Sarah whimpered. I know, sweetheart, medicine's coming. Michael watched them, 2 halves of a whole sharing pain like they'd shared a womb. He thought of his unit in Ukraine, brothers in everything but blood. I had a battle buddy, he said quietly. Alex. We served 3 tours together. When I got hit with shrapnel, he carried me 2 miles to the medic, said pain shared is pain halved. These two share everything, Denise said. Sometimes I think they feel each other's hurt more than their own. That's love, strongest force in any army. Over the following weeks, Michael donated blood like clockwork, twice monthly for whole blood, twice weekly for plasma. The twins' crises decreased. Their hospital stays shortened. One day he found them in the playroom, building with blocks. Sergeant Mike. They spoke in unison, as they often did. Builders. Today? It's a hospital, Sarah explained. But a happy one. Where kids get better, Samuel added. And nobody cries. I like it. Need help? They worked in companionable silence, 3 architects of hope. Finally, Sarah asked, Why do you give us your blood? Because I can. Because you need it. But doesn't it hurt? A little. But you know what hurts more? What? They asked together. Watching brave kids fight alone. Samuel and Sarah exchanged one of their telepathic looks. We're not alone. Not anymore, Michael agreed. The brain tumor grew faster than predicted. By month 4, Michael's coordination faltered. Words sometimes escaped him, but his mission continued with military precision. His final recipient would be Emma Vasquez, 9 years old, congenital heart defect. 2 years on the transplant list, watching other children receive hearts while hers stuttered toward failure. She was in the room next to his now, both of them waiting. The irony wasn't lost. His failing brain, her failing heart. 2 time bombs, ticking at different speeds. Does it hurt? Emma asked during one of his clear moments. Dying, Michael considered the question with the gravity it deserved. Like falling asleep when you're very tired. Fighting it hurts. Accepting it, that's different. I don't want to accept it. Then don't. Fight until the very last second. That's what hearts do, they fight. Is that what yours does? Every beat is a small revolution against the dark. Emma smiled. I like that. Revolutionary hearts. Want to know a secret? She nodded. Hearts have memory. They remember every battle, every victory, every moment of courage. When mine becomes yours, it'll remember how to fight. Will it remember you? Maybe. But more importantly, it'll remember how to win. The night before the final surgery, Michael's unit from Ukraine video called. 5 survivors from his squad, faces older but brotherhood intact. Heard what you're doing, Sarge, Corporal Davis said. Giving away the farm. Just equipment transfer, standard procedure. Bullshit. You're running a one-man medevac operation. Someone has to. Kids are dying. And you're not? Captain Williams asked gently. We're all dying, Cap. I'm just doing it with a purpose. Does it feel like completion? Private Johnson asked. Like finishing the mission? Michael thought of his list. 23 children, dozens of organs and tissues donated, lives saved, futures secured. No. Feels like beginning something. These kids, they'll grow up knowing sacrifice isn't abstract, that strangers bled for them. Literally. Maybe they'll pay it forward. Or maybe they'll just live, Williams said. That's enough, Mike. Living well is its own victory. They talked until Michael's medication kicked in. Old stories, bad jokes. The careful dance soldiers do around goodbye. When they signed off, Michael opened his notebook one last time, wrote letters to each child, sealed them, asked the nurse to deliver them after. To Emma he wrote, Hearts are time machines. They carry everything that was into everything that will be. Mine has known fear and love, war and peace. It's been shattered and rebuilt. Now it's yours. Beat strongly. Love fiercely. Fight always. Remember, you carry warrior's blood now. Not because I was a soldier, but because we're all warriors when we choose to save each other. Make it mean something. Michael. The surgery was scheduled for dawn. Michael spent his last conscious hours listening to Emma's heart monitor from the next room. Irregular, struggling, fighting. Soon it would beat strong and steady, revolutionary to the end. Ready, Sergeant? Dr. Chen asked as they prepped him. One thing, Michael said. Tell her, tell all of them. They were never anonymous to me. I knew their names, their stories, their dreams. They were my mission, my victory, my grace. The anesthesia took hold. Michael's last thought was of Anya, of promises kept, of debts repaid 100-fold. Above in OR3, Emma Vasquez was already under, chest open, old heart failing, waiting for salvation. Below, Michael Torres gave his final order to his own body. Hold the line. The harvest began. 8 hours later, Emma woke with thunder in her chest. Strong, steady, revolutionary. The heart that had kept cadence through Ukrainian winters now beat for a 9-year-old girl who'd never seen snow. It remembered how to fight. It taught her how to win. The memorial service was held 6 months later. Not in a church or funeral home, but in the children's ward at Johns Hopkins. Michael had requested it in his will, said he wanted his memorial where his mission had lived. All 23 recipients came, some walked, some wheeled, all lived. Emma spoke for them all, Michael's heart steady in her chest. He called himself a soldier to the end. But he was wrong. Soldiers follow orders. Michael Torres chose his own mission. He declared war on death itself, not with weapons but with willing sacrifice. He gave me his heart. Maria got his kidney. David, part of his liver. Tommy, his marrow. Sarah and Samuel, his blood. Others received corneas, skin grafts, bone tissue, pieces of life parsed out with tactical precision. We are his victory. We are his legacy. We are proof that love is logistical, that sacrifice can be scheduled, that death, properly managed, is just another resource to be allocated wisely. He told me hearts have memory. Mine remembers. It remembers courage and commitment. It remembers how to fight. It remembers him. Dr. Chen read from Michael's notebook, the meticulous records of his donations, each child's story carefully documented. But the final entry was different. Dated the night before his last surgery. Mission report, Operation Lazarus. Objectives, 23 critical targets identified, all engaged, all secured. Resources allocated, 2 kidneys, liver segments, heart, lungs, corneas, bone marrow, skin tissue, blood products. Mission status, complete. Casualties, 1 acceptable loss. Victory conditions, watch them grow, watch them thrive, watch them remember that strangers can be family, that sacrifice can be joy, that death is just another hill to take. Final orders. Tell them I was honored to serve. The children stood then one by one. Maria, off dialysis. David, already accepted to Juilliard. Tommy, cancer in remission. The twins, crisis-free for 6 months. Others, walking miracles all. Emma was last. We've started a foundation. The Torres Protocol, connecting willing donors with waiting children. Because he showed us, death doesn't have to be waste. It can be gift. She pulled out a worn paper. He left us orders, final ones. Want to hear them? Nods all around. Live like you're borrowed time, because you are. Love like you're carrying someone else's heart, because you might be. Fight like you've got warrior's blood, because you do. And remember, you were never anonymous to him, neither was he to you. They planted a tree in the hospital courtyard. An oak, strong, enduring, giving shade to generations. Like Michael's. Gifts rooted in sacrifice branching into tomorrow. At the base, a simple plaque, Sergeant Michael Torres, 1995-2023. He gave everything we live his victory. As the ceremony ended, Emma felt her heart skip, not from illness, but from emotion. It settled back into rhythm quickly, strong, steady, revolutionary. Sometimes late at night she swears she can feel it remembering. Not memories exactly, but impressions. Snow falling on foreign streets, the weight of a rifle, the smaller weight of a dying child. The decision to make death count for something. She touches her chest when this happens, whispers, I remember too. And somewhere in whatever comes after, Michael Torres stands watch. Mission complete. Victory absolute. 23 hearts beating with borrowed time, purchased with willing sacrifice. The last mission continues. In me, every beat, in every breath, in every life saved by those who learned that donation isn't about dying. It's about refusing to let death win. They are his memory now, his revolution, his grace, and they remember. Always. The government killed Frank Westfield on a Tuesday. He was standing in his kitchen when it happened, stirring a pot of beef stew while rain tapped against the window. The letter sat on his counter, official government seal mocking him from cream-colored paper. 3 paragraphs of bureaucratic language that boiled down to 6 devastating words. Our records indicate you are deceased. Frank's weathered hands trembled as he read it again. 43 years alive after Vietnam, and some computer program had just erased him with a keystroke. Well, he said to his empty kitchen, this complicates things. His bank account would be frozen within days. The modest pension that kept his lights on and refrigerator stocked would stop. At 71, with a bad knee and worse lungs, Frank wasn't exactly employable. The stew suddenly smelled like ashes in his mouth. The Veterans Affairs office in downtown Portland was a monument to efficiency, in the same way Frank's old M16 had been a precision instrument, which is to say, not at all. The waiting area buzzed, with fluorescent lights and quiet desperation. Men and women of various ages and conflicts sat with identical 1,000-yard stares, waiting for their numbers to be called. Frank clutched ticket B47 while the electronic display showed A96. He'd been waiting 3 hours already, watching the numbers crawl forward. His knee throbbed from sitting so long, but he'd be damned if he'd leave without fixing this nonsense. Mr. Westfield? The receptionist's voice startled him. B47, window 6. Frank shuffled forward. Letter and identification ready. The woman behind the glass looked barely 30, her eyes tired and her smile practiced. How can I help you today? Her name tag read, Sandra. I'm dead, apparently, Frank said, sliding the letter through the narrow opening below the glass. Government. Says so, but I'm feeling pretty spry for a corpse. Sandra's smile didn't waver as she skimmed the letter. Frank had rehearsed this moment all morning. Stay calm, be polite, let the system correct its mistake. One moment, Sandra said, tapping at her keyboard. I'll need to check your status in our system. Frank nodded, drumming his fingers on the counter. In his mind, this would be quick. Obvious human error, maybe a joke. He pictured Sandra making a couple of keystrokes, laughing softly and saying, All fixed, Mr. Westfield, so sorry for the confusion. I'm showing deceased status in our system, Sandra said instead, her voice dropping to a practiced sympathy. Cause of death is listed as cardiac arrest, dated April 17th. Frank blinked. That was last week. I was at my grandson's baseball game. Our records indicate a death certificate was filed. I'm standing right here. Frank's voice rose, drawing glances from the waiting area. Do I look dead to you? Sandra's professional smile returned. Sir, I understand this is frustrating, but I can only work with what's in the system. Well, fix the system, it's wrong. I can't override a death certificate, Mr. Westfield. You'll need to visit the county records office to dispute this. Frank closed his eyes, fighting for patience. And what am I supposed to do about my pension until then? My account's frozen. You'll need to file Form 21-8049. Request for reinstatement of benefits following erroneous death status. Sandra slid a thick packet through the opening. Processing time is approximately 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8? Frank stopped himself. Listen, I can't wait that long. I have rent due next week. I'm sorry, but that's the process. Next, the county records office was worse. A windowless basement with filing cabinets that looked like they'd survived the Cold War. Frank waited another 2 hours before a harried clerk informed him that yes, a death certificate had indeed been filed. For Franklin Westfield, same social security number, same birth date. But I'm not dead, Frank insisted for what felt like the 100th time that day. The clerk, a thin man with thick glasses and a name tag reading Doug, looked at him with something between pity and suspicion. "Sir, I can see that, but the certificate was filed through proper channels. Someone entered your information. Who would do that?" Doug shrugged. "Could be a clerical error. Could be identity theft. Could be another Franklin Westfield died and someone mixed up the social security numbers. So fix it. You'll need to file a petition for vital records correction." Doug handed him another form. "And provide evidence that you're, alive." Frank stared at him. "What evidence? Me standing here breathing isn't enough? You'll need notarized affidavits, medical records from the past 30 days, and a letter from a licensed physician confirming your continued existence." Doug's tone suggested he found this perfectly reasonable. "Then we'll review your petition and make a determination." "How long will that take?" 4 to 6 months, typically. Frank felt something snap inside him, a small, vital piece of his tolerance for bureaucratic nonsense. "I don't have 4 to 6 months. I have bills now." "Sir, if you can't maintain a professional tone..." "Professional?" Frank leaned forward. "I served this country for 8 years. I took shrapnel in my leg. I've paid taxes for 5 decades. And now I'm being told I need to prove I'm alive because some computer says I'm not?" Doug's face hardened. "Sir, please lower your voice or I'll have to call security." As if on cue, a uniformed guard by the door straightened up, watching Frank with sudden interest. "This is insane," Frank muttered, gathering his papers. "Absolutely insane." That night, Frank sat at his kitchen table with a glass of whiskey and a pile of forms. His phone showed 4 missed calls, 2 from his daughter Sarah in Seattle, 1 from his bank, and 1 from his landlord. He ignored them all. On his laptop screen, a Social Security Administration form taunted him. Correction of death information. The irony might have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. His pension would have hit his account tomorrow. Rent was due in 5 days. The frozen bank account meant his automatic bill payments would bounce. His credit score, carefully maintained over decades, would plummet. Frank took another sip of whiskey, feeling the burn down his throat. Outside, Portland's rain had intensified, drumming against the roof of his modest apartment. The sound usually soothed him, but tonight it felt like another assault. His eye caught the corner of his closet, where a garment bag held his old dress uniform. He hadn't worn it in years, not since a fellow veteran's funeral in 2019. The sight of it triggered something in his mind, an idea so absurd it might just work. Frank moved to his closet, pulling out the uniform with careful hands. The medals clinked softly against each other. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Vietnam Service Medal. Tangible proof of a life devoted to service, now deemed administratively non-existent. The next morning he dialed Sarah's number. "Dad, I've been trying to reach you. The bank called me because I'm on your emergency contact list. What's going on?" Frank explained the situation in measured tones, finishing with, "I need a favor, sweetheart. That fancy camera of yours. Bring it downtown tomorrow. Pioneer Courthouse Square, noon." "Dad, what are you planning?" "Something stupid," Frank admitted. "But I'm out of smart options." The uniform still fit, more or less. The jacket was tight across the shoulders, and the pants needed an extra notch on the belt, but the effect was what mattered. Frank had polished his medals until they gleamed, the brass catching sunlight as he stepped out of his bus onto the brick expanse of Pioneer Courthouse Square. The sign he carried was simple, made from a piece of cardboard and black marker. Veteran. Declared dead by government, still walking and breathing, no pension, no health care, no dignity. Sarah waited near the steps, camera in hand. Her face showed equal parts worry and pride. "You sure about this, Dad?" Frank nodded, settling his cap more firmly on his gray hair. Sometimes the only way to fight absurdity is with more absurdity. He took his position at the center of the square, where the lunchtime crowd was beginning to gather. Portland's business district hummed with activity. Tech workers, government employees, tourists. Frank held his sign high, straightened his posture to military attention, and simply stood. At first, people barely glanced his way. Portland had its share of protesters and street performers. But something about the old man in the decorated uniform, standing as rigid as a flagpole, began to draw attention. A young woman in business attire stopped first, reading his sign with a furrowed brow. She pulled out her phone, snapped a picture, and typed something. 2 college students paused next, then a group of tourists. Within 15 minutes, a small crowd had gathered. Frank said nothing. He didn't need to. The sign and uniform told his story. Sarah circled carefully, capturing images from different angles while occasionally answering questions from onlookers. "Is this for real?" a man in a suit asked her. "Unfortunately, yes," Sarah replied, loud enough for others to hear. "My father served in Vietnam. Last week some government system declared him dead. His accounts are frozen, pensions stopped. Nobody will help because the proper channels take months." The man scowled. "That's outrageous." A woman with a press badge approached. "I'm with the Oregonian. Would your father be willing to talk to me about this?" Sarah glanced at Frank, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, but not here," Sarah said. "His contact information is on the back of the sign." By 1 o'clock, Frank's knees were screaming in protest, but he maintained his position. The crowd had grown to over 50 people. Some took photos, others made phone calls, a few shouted encouragement. Sarah had set up a live stream on her social media accounts, narrating her father's situation to a growing virtual audience. At 2 o'clock, a police officer approached. "Sir, do you have a permit for this demonstration?" Frank didn't break his stance or speak. Sarah stepped forward. "He's a single citizen exercising his right to free speech," she said. "No amplification, no obstruction. Does he need a permit for that?" The officer glanced at Frank's medals, then at the gathering crowd, clearly calculating the optics of confronting a decorated veteran. "Just keep the walkways clear," he finally said, before retreating. By 4 o'clock, Frank's story had escaped the confines of the square. Sarah's live stream had been shared thousands of times. Local news vans had arrived. "Not Dead Yet" was trending in Portland, with people sharing their own bureaucratic nightmares alongside Frank's images. Frank's phone rang in his pocket. Sarah had given his number to select reporters. He ignored it, maintaining his vigil. This wasn't about interviews or attention. This was about dignity. At 5 o'clock, as office workers streamed past on their way home, a suited man pushed through the crowd. He looked vaguely familiar to Frank, though he couldn't place him. "Mr. Westfield," the man said urgently. "I'm Thomas Garrett, director of the Portland VA office. Could we speak privately?" Frank broke his stance for the first time in hours. "Anything you have to say to me, you can say right here." Garrett winced, eyes darting to the phones recording around them. "We've been made aware of your situation. I want to assure you we're working to expedite a resolution." "Expedite?" Frank's voice carried across the square. "Yesterday I was told 6 to 8 weeks. Today, you're expediting? What changed?" Garrett flushed. "We take veterans' concerns very seriously. You took me seriously when I became a PR problem," Frank corrected. "Not when I was just a man asking for help." A cheer went up from the crowd. Garrett's expression tightened. "Mr. Westfield, if you'll come to my office right now, I can personally ensure your benefits are reinstated by tomorrow morning." Frank studied the man's face, seeing the desperation to get him, and his story, out of the public eye. "No," he said. "No?" Garrett looked stunned. "I'll be here tomorrow and the next day and the next until this gets fixed, not just for me, but for every veteran dealing with this nonsense." That night, Frank could barely walk. His knees had locked up after standing for hours, and Sarah had to help him to her car. But as they drove to her apartment where he'd stay until his accounts were unfrozen, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. National news outlets, veterans advocacy groups, government officials. His story had gone viral. In the most spectacular way, video of his exchange with Garrett had over 1 million views already. "We never expected this," Sarah said, scrolling through her own notifications. "Listen to this. Veteran declared dead by government stages his own resurrection." "That's CNN," Frank grunted, massaging his knee. "I just wanted my damn pension back." "Well, you're getting more than that. Look." She handed him her phone, showing a statement from the Department of Veterans Affairs promising an immediate review of vital records, verification procedures, and expedited resolution for Mr. Westfield and any veterans facing similar issues. Frank snorted. "We'll see." But by morning, the miracle had happened. His bank called to inform him his accounts had been unfrozen. The VA had issued an emergency reinstatement of his benefits, with back pay for the missed period. The county records office had expunged the erroneous death certificate. More surprisingly, he wasn't alone. Veterans across the country began coming forward with similar stories. Erroneous death reports, benefits suddenly stopped, health care denied. Frank's viral moment had cracked open a nationwide issue. 2 days later, Frank returned to Pioneer. Courthouse Square, this time accompanied by a dozen other veterans, each with their own story of bureaucratic abandonment. National news cameras lined the square. Frank's uniform was crisper this time, his posture straighter despite the pain. His sign had changed. "I'm alive, they're alive. Veterans deserve better," across the country. Similar demonstrations sprouted, veterans in uniform standing in silence, demanding accountability from a system that had forgotten them. 6 months later, Frank sat in a congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., a place he never imagined he'd be. The committee members looked alternately bored and engaged as they questioned him. "Mr. Westfield," said the chairwoman, "your story has highlighted serious deficiencies in our systems. Can you tell us what changes you'd like to see?" Frank leaned forward to the microphone. "I'm just an old soldier, ma'am, not a policy expert. But I know this. When a computer says a man is dead, and the man says he's alive, somebody ought to believe the man." Laughter rippled through the room. "More seriously," Frank continued, "veterans deserve a system that treats them like humans, not case numbers. When errors happen, and they will, there needs to be a way to fix them quickly. Nobody should have to stage a protest to get their dignity back." After the hearing, as Frank walked slowly down the marble corridors of the Capitol, a young veteran in a wheelchair caught up to him. "Mr. Westfield," the man said, extending his hand, "I just wanted to thank you. The system declared me dead 3 years ago. I've been fighting ever since. After your protest, they fixed it in a week." Frank gripped the younger man's hand. "I didn't do anything special, just got angry in the right place at the right time. Sometimes that's all it takes," the man replied. Outside, the spring air in Washington felt fresh against Frank's face. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah with a news alert. Veterans Records Modernization Act passes committee. The bill, inspired by his case, would overhaul how the government tracked and verified veterans' status, with simplified appeals processes and emergency reinstatement provisions. Frank smiled slightly. He'd never wanted to be an activist or a symbol. He just wanted what was his, the pension he'd earned, the recognition he deserved. But sometimes, standing up for yourself meant standing up for everyone like you. He pocketed his phone and made his way down the Capitol steps, each one a small victory against his damaged knee. Tomorrow he'd fly home to Portland, back to his apartment and his quiet life. The government had killed him on paper, but in fighting back, he'd never felt more alive. Behind him, the Capitol dome gleamed in the afternoon sun, indifferent as ever. But somewhere in its labyrinthine halls, a system was changing, one error message at a time. The first gunshot Ellen Garrison ever heard wasn't in Afghanistan. It was in her father's backyard in Montana when she was 9, shooting tin cans off a fence. The last gunshot she heard was the one that tore through her shoulder at Fob Cobra, ending her military career and nearly her life. She never expected to hear another one in the quiet halls of Westlake High, but she always knew someone would try. Ellen adjusted her blue security uniform as she walked the empty corridor of Westlake High School at 6:15 a.m. Outside, the Pennsylvania autumn painted the trees in amber and rust, but inside, the fluorescent lights cast the same sterile glow they did every morning. She preferred arriving before anyone else, checking doors, testing locks, surveying the grounds. Westlake was her new battlefield, though no one knew it but her. Her routine never varied. South entrance, gymnasium, cafeteria, each classroom wing. then the administrative offices. She moved with quiet efficiency, her footsteps barely audible, on the polished linoleum. The maintenance staff had learned not to be startled when they turned a corner to find her there. Mr. Jenkins called her the ghost, behind her back. She'd heard him once but never acknowledged it. She preferred being a ghost. Ghosts were watchful. Ghosts were vigilant. Ghosts saw everything but remained unseen. Principal Davidson had once attempted small talk in her first month, asking about her background. "Security work?" he'd asked hopefully. "Something like that," she'd replied, and he never asked again. By 7:30, the first teachers arrived, nodding perfunctorily as they passed. Ellen returned each greeting with the same tight nod, professional, distant, forgettable, just as she'd intended. At the morning security checkpoint, she watched the students file in, faces still puffy with sleep, shoulders weighed down by backpacks and adolescent drama. She knew 213 names out of the 347 students, memorized from ID cards and attendance sheets. She recognized patterns: who arrived early, who rushed in late, who walked alone, who traveled in packs. She knew which kids needed watching and which ones needed protecting, often from themselves. "Shoelace," she said quietly as Tyler Mendez passed through the metal detector. He looked down, surprised, then bent to tie it. A small nod of thanks. Ellen had already moved on. Nobody looked at her face for more than a second. That was how she wanted it. The uniform was what they saw. The authority, not the person. Certainly, not the decorated captain who'd once commanded a specialized medical extraction team. Not the woman who'd carried wounded soldiers through gunfire. Not the officer who'd received 3 commendations before disappearing from military records. Just Mrs. Garrison, the school security guard who never smiled. "I swear she sleeps standing up in that security office," Bree Matthews whispered to her friend Alyssa as they pulled books from their lockers. "Like vampire style or something." Alyssa giggled. "My brother had her last year. Said she caught him trying to sneak out during assembly by just appearing behind him. Didn't say anything, just pointed back to the auditorium." "Have you ever actually heard her speak?" Bree asked, closing her locker. "Like full sentences?" "No way. My dad thinks she's ex-military or something. He said she has that look." "What look?" "You know, like she's always scanning for threats. My dad did 2 tours in Iraq, says he can spot it." The warning bell rang, and students began hurrying to first period. As they turned the corner, a freshman with his eyes glued to his phone collided, directly with Mrs. Garrison, sending her coffee tumbling from her hand. The cup never hit the ground. In one fluid motion that seemed impossibly fast for someone her age, Mrs. Garrison's hand shot out and caught the falling cup mid-air, barely, spilling a drop. The freshman stood frozen, eyes wide with fear. The hallway fell silent. "Sorry," the boy squeaked. Mrs. Garrison regarded him with those unreadable gray eyes. "Pay attention to your surroundings," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. Then she continued her patrol as if nothing had happened. "Holy shit," Bree whispered as they hurried to class. "Did you see how fast she moved?" But Alyssa was staring at something else. "Did you see her wrist when her sleeve pulled up? That was a serious scar." In the teacher's lounge, conversation briefly turned to the school's most enigmatic employee. "Tried to invite her to the staff holiday party again," said Ms. Reynolds, the English teacher. "Same response as last year. Thank you, but I have plans." No elaboration. "She turned down hall monitor duty during prom," added Mr. Delaney, the vice principal. "First time she's ever refused an assignment. Wonder what that was about." "Too many exits to watch at once," said Ms. Chen from the math department. "I heard her tell Davidson that the setup was tactically unsound. Who talks like that?" "Someone who takes school security way too seriously," Delaney replied. "I mean, this is Westlake, not Kabul. What does she think is going to happen?" None of them noticed Ellen passing by the half-open door, catching every word. She'd learned long ago that being underestimated was an advantage. Let them think she was paranoid. Let them think she was cold. What mattered was being ready for what they couldn't imagine. In her small office, a converted storage room near the main entrance, Ellen unlocked her metal desk drawer and checked the contents for the third time that day. A neat roll of gauze, 2 compression bandages, a tourniquet, trauma shears, quick clot packets, a small flashlight, items that reminded her of another life, arranged with military precision. Beside them lay a worn metal identification tag, the letters partially obscured by years of handling. She never wore it anymore, but she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. Some ghost followed you no matter how far you ran. Her radio crackled to life. "Routine check all zones," said the automated system. "Zone 1, clear," she responded, automatically. "Zone 2 clear," came the voice of the part-time security guard who handled the athletic fields. Ellen put away the medical supplies and resumed her patrol. 5 more hours until dismissal. 5 more hours of vigilance that most days led to nothing, just the way she liked it. Thursday afternoons were always the hardest. Something about the proximity to the weekend made students restless, teachers distracted. Ellen felt it too, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, an uptick in minor infractions. She'd written 3 reports already: a bathroom vandalism, an attempted vape in the science wing, a verbal altercation in the cafeteria. She was logging the incidents when her radio came to life again. "Mrs. Garrison," said the front desk administrator, her voice oddly tight. "Can you check the south entrance?" Door alarm was triggered. Ellen's body tensed before her mind had even processed the words. South entrance, the service corridor leading from the back parking lot. Rarely used except by maintenance. No deliveries scheduled today. "Copy," she replied, already moving. She walked briskly down the main hallway, past classrooms filled with students oblivious to the sudden acceleration of her pulse. The familiar weight of alertness settled over her, the mental clarity she hadn't needed to summon in years. At the junction leading to the administrative wing, she made a quick detour to her office. The security monitor showed a grainy image of the south entrance, a man in a long coat standing just inside the doorway, looking down at something in his hands. A visitor badge? No. He wasn't heading toward the front desk, and his posture was wrong. Too rigid, too deliberate. An oversized backpack hung awkwardly from one shoulder. Ellen reached into her desk drawer, past the medical supplies, to the false bottom she'd installed her first week. Inside was a slim case containing non-lethal security equipment she'd privately purchased. Military-grade pepper spray, zip tie restraints, a tactical flashlight with a strobe setting capable of momentary disorientation. Nothing that would raise eyebrows if discovered, but in practiced hands enough to control a situation. She fastened the equipment to her belt under her uniform jacket and radioed back. Visual confirmation of unauthorized entry. Male subject, approximately 40-45, dark coat, large backpack, proceeding to intercept. "Should I call the police?" asked the administrator. Ellen paused for a fraction of a second. False alarm? Possibly. Overreaction? Maybe. But the way he'd bypassed security protocols, the unnatural tension in his stance? Not yet. Stand by. Lock down Wing C as precaution. Wing C, where the freshmen were having study hall, the farthest point from the south entrance. If she was wrong, it would be a minor disruption. If she was right, Ellen moved silently toward the south corridor, cutting through the empty band room to approach from an unexpected angle. Through the window in the door, she caught another glimpse of the man. He was studying a piece of paper now, a map of some kind, and reaching into his backpack. Her training took over. She texted a pre-written code to Principal Davidson. 1, they'd established for emergencies, and then silenced her radio. No distractions now. Surveillance first. Assess, then engage. The man was moving toward the main hallway, his gait unnaturally stiff, eyes darting. Not the behavior of a parent or visitor. Ellen slipped behind him, keeping to the shadows of the poorly lit service corridor. When he paused at the intersection leading to the main hall, she made her decision. "School security," she said firmly, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. Put down your backpack and identify yourself. The man froze, then turned, slowly. His eyes widened when he saw only a middle-aged woman in a security uniform. The momentary relief in his expression told Ellen everything she needed to know. He bolted. Ellen was after him in an instant, moving with a speed that would have shocked anyone who knew her only as the taciturn security guard. The man was heading not toward the exit but deeper into the school, toward the cafeteria where lunch period was just beginning. She cut through a classroom, startling a teacher mid-lecture, and emerged in the hallway ahead of him. The man skidded, to a stop reaching into his coat. Ellen didn't hesitate. The tactical flashlight came out first. 3 rapid strobe bursts directly into his eyes, temporary sensory overload. As he flinched, she closed the distance, one hand striking precisely at the bundle of nerves in his wrist. Whatever he'd been reaching for clattered to the floor, a handgun just as she'd feared. The man recovered quickly, swinging wildly with his other arm, strong but untrained. Ellen sidestepped easily, years of combat training flowing back into her muscles. She caught his arm, using his own momentum to spin him off balance, and drove her knee into the side of his leg, not to injure, but to buckle his stance. He went down hard. Ellen was on him immediately, pulling his arms behind his back with practiced efficiency and securing them with zip ties. The entire takedown had lasted less than 15 seconds. Only then did she notice the gathering crowd, students and teachers, drawn by the commotion, staring in disbelief at the school security guard kneeling calmly on the back of a subdued attacker, the weapon safely kicked aside. "Someone call 911, she said quietly, "and clear this hallway, now." Principal Davidson paced the conference room, occasionally glancing through the window at the chaos outside. 3 police cars, an ambulance, and a growing cluster of news vans filled the parking lot. Inside, officers were still cataloging evidence from the gunman's backpack: a semi-automatic pistol, additional ammunition, crude diagrams of the school's layout with the cafeteria circled in red. "They're saying you saved dozens of lives," Davidson said, his voice still shaky. "If he'd reached the cafeteria..." Ellen sat rigid in her chair, her uniform still immaculate despite the struggle. The only evidence of the confrontation was a small tear on her sleeve and the controlled rhythm of her breathing. The same breathing techniques she'd once taught her medical team to use during extraction under fire. "I was doing my job," she said simply. "Your job is to check hall passes and watch for truants," Davidson said. Not this." He gestured helplessly toward the window. "The officers said you disabled him like a trained professional." Ellen said nothing. A knock at the door interrupted them. A police officer entered, followed by an older man in a suit who carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. "Principal Davidson? I'm Lieutenant Colonel Matthews, Pennsylvania State Police. Mind if we have a word with Mrs. Garrison?" Davidson nodded and excused himself. The moment the door closed, the officer's demeanor changed. "Captain Garrison," he said quietly. "I thought you looked familiar from the security footage. 10th Mountain, Division FOB Cobra, Medical Extraction Specialist." He paused. "You disappeared after the ambush in 2009. Ellen's face remained impassive. "I was honorably discharged, with 3 commendations for valor and a classified service record." The officer studied her closely. "You've been off the grid for 14 years. "I never went off any grid, I just came home. To work as a high school security guard. With your background?" Ellen finally met his gaze. "What exactly do you want from me, Lieutenant Colonel?" "Just to understand. The shooter had military training, dishonorable discharge from the Marines 3 years ago, history of threats against schools. Yet you took him down without a weapon, without backup, without so much as raising your voice." He leaned forward. "Why here, Captain? Why not federal security, private sector, something that uses your skills?" Ellen looked out the window at the school grounds, at the students being reunited with frightened parents. "Because this is where I'm needed," she said simply. "Places like this, they have guards but no security. They have drills but no preparation. They have policies but no protection. She touched the old scar on her wrist unconsciously. After Cobra, after losing my team, I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere I could still serve a purpose. Before Matthews could respond, the door burst open and a teenage girl rushed in, ignoring the protests of the officer outside. "Mrs. Garrison!" It was Bree Matthews, eyes red from crying. "They're saying you saved us, that you fought him, that you're some kind of soldier?" Ellen stood slowly. "Miss Matthews, you shouldn't be in here." "Is it true?" Bree demanded. "All this time you were... what? Special forces or something?" "Medical extraction team," Ellen corrected quietly. "We got the wounded out." Bree stared at her. The aloof security guard who'd scared freshmen with her stern silence, now revealed as something else entirely. "I don't understand. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? Why did you let us all think you were just..." "Just what?" Ellen asked. "Just mean," Bree finished lamely. "Scary. Like you hated being here." For the first time in her tenure at Westlake High, Ellen Garrison smiled, a small, sad curve of the lips that transformed her severe face. "I never hated being here," she said gently. "I was watching over you, all of you." The following Monday, Ellen arrived at her usual time, 6:15 a.m., half expecting to find the locks changed. Surely after the revelations, after the media circus of the weekend, decorated veteran prevents school shooting had made national headlines, the school board would decide she was too much of a liability. Her key still worked. The halls were still empty. Her routine remained unchanged. South entrance, gymnasium, cafeteria, each classroom wing. Then the administrative offices. The familiar pattern soothed her. Only when she reached the main entrance did she notice something different. The bare wall beside her tiny office, usually empty except for the fire evacuation plan, was now covered with a massive collage of handwritten notes, photographs, and drawings. "Our guardian angel. Thank you for protecting us. The real Mrs. G. Hero in disguise." In the center was a photocopy of a military photograph someone had found online. Ellen in combat fatigues in Afghanistan, younger, standing with her medical team, actually smiling. Beside it was a newer photo, taken without her knowledge, showing her at her post by the main entrance, watchful and alert in her blue security uniform. Ellen stared at the display, a lump forming in her throat. For years she'd worked to be invisible, to be forgotten, to leave behind the pain of what she'd lost. Yet here was her past and present side by side, seen and acknowledged by those she'd silently protected. "We took a vote," said a voice behind her. Ellen turned to find Principal Davidson and a group of students, including Bry, standing awkwardly in the hall. "A vote?" Ellen echoed. "On what to call you," Davidson explained, looking both intimidated and proud. "The board wanted to promote you to head of security, but the students had other ideas." Bree stepped forward, holding a new security badge. Instead of security officer, it read Guardian. "We thought it fit better," Bree said, offering the badge. "If that's okay?" Ellen took the badge, turning it over in her calloused hands. For 14 years she'd been running from who she was, what she'd seen, what she'd lost. She'd hidden in plain sight, finding purpose in anonymous vigilance. Her silence had been armor, her invisibility a shield. But shields worked both ways. They kept danger out, and connection too. "Thank you," Ellen said, her voice steady as she pinned on the new badge. "I'd be honored." As the first bell rang and students began filing in, Ellen took her position by the main entrance. But this time, as each student passed, she did something new. She looked them in the eye and smiled. For the first time in 14 years, Ellen Garrison wasn't a ghost anymore. And for the first time since Fob Cobra, that felt right. Nobody had known who she was, but now they did. And somehow that made her stronger. The first punch took Tommy down faster than any of us expected. One moment my 73-year-old buddy was standing his ground. The next he was sprawled across the sticky bar floor, blood pooling from his split lip. That's how we treat dinosaurs who don't know when to shut up, laughed the biker with knuckle tattoos. Hate on the right hand, ride on the left. Big bastard. Leather vest straining against a beer gut, Confederate flag patch on his sleeve. Tommy spat blood, his arthritic hands, struggling to find purchase on the floor. Korean War vet, 2 Purple Hearts reduced to crawling at the boots of a bar thug. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling with a mix of rage and Parkinson's. The screen blurred through my cataracts, but I didn't need to see clearly to send. The text I'd drafted hours ago when the bikers first started causing trouble. SOS, VFW bar, code homecoming. The response came immediately. Cavalry inbound. 20 minutes. Hold position. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked across the table at Frank and Bill. Our silent consensus was clear. 20 minutes was a lifetime in a bar fight. But we'd faced worse odds in Vietnam. We'd hold. Son, I said to Knuckles, my voice steadier than my hands, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Veterans of foreign wars post-713 had been our sanctuary for decades. Every Thursday, at 1900 hours sharp, 5 old soldiers gathered at the corner table to drink cheap beer and share expensive memories. Me, Tommy, Frank, Bill, and Pete. What remained of a once larger circle whittled down by time and illness. We weren't the only vets who used the place. Scattered around the bar were men and women from more recent conflicts. Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. But Thursday nights belonged to us, the last of the Vietnam generation in our town. Tonight had started like any other. Tommy complaining about his new heart medication. Frank showing off pictures of his newest great-grandchild. Bill nursing a single beer to make it last the evening. Fixed income didn't stretch to second rounds anymore. Pete hadn't shown. 3rd week in a row. Hospice care had a strict schedule and visiting hours ended at 5 p.m. The bikers arrived around 8 p.m., half a dozen men in leather cuts displaying Iron Reaper's MC patches. Not local. Passing through, looking for entertainment in a town with limited options. They'd been loud but tolerable until they noticed Tommy's Vietnam veteran cap. Hey, Pops, Knuckles called across the room. Your hat says Vietnam. You one of them baby killers or just a remf who scraped shit from the latrines? The bar went quiet. Tommy, who'd survived 2 tours and came home with shrapnel still embedded in his back, turned slowly in his seat. Son, I'd suggest you enjoy your drink and leave the past where it belongs. Sounds like a remf to me, Knuckles smirked to his buddies. Real warriors don't mind talking about their kills. I put a restraining hand on Tommy's arm. His blood pressure was already a medical concern and a confrontation wouldn't help. Let it go, I murmured. Not worth it. But Knuckles wasn't finished. He sauntered over, beer in hand, towering over our table. You boys look like you're past. Your expiration date. Why don't you clear out, let real men use this table? Frank, the diplomat of our group, tried next. Plenty of tables available, friend. We'll be done soon enough. I'm not your friend, old man, Knuckles growled, then deliberately poured beer over Frank's photographs. Oops. Guess your little brat's pictures got wet. That's when Tommy stood up. 5'8" of elderly defiance, facing down 6 feet of tattooed aggression. You need to leave, Tommy said quietly. Now. The punch came without warning. Knuckles moved fast for a big man, his fist connecting with Tommy's jaw, sending his glasses flying. And that's how we found ourselves in a standoff, Tommy bleeding. On the floor, 5 other bikers moving to surround our table and the rest of the bar patrons suddenly finding reasons to look away. The young bartender was already reaching for the phone, but who would he call? Local police were 20 minutes out from anywhere and we didn't have 20 minutes. What we did have was reinforcements of our own. You have no idea what's coming, Bill said calmly, speaking for the first time that evening. The quietest of our group, he'd served as a sniper. 3 tours. His confirmed kills remained a number he'd never shared, even with us. Knuckles laughed. What's coming? Heart attacks, ambulances, bedtime? I helped Tommy to his seat, pressing a napkin to his bleeding lip. Frank, how's your grandson doing at Fort Benning? Frank dabbed at his soaked photographs, voice conversational. Finished. Ranger school last month. deployed to the base 20 miles north, along with about 50 of his closest friends. That right? I turned to Bill. And your granddaughter? She's still flying those Apache helicopters? Bill smiled thinly. Made captain last year. Very protective of her grandpa. The bikers exchanged glances, sensing something beneath the casual conversation. What the fuck are you old-timers talking about? Knuckles demanded. Just catching up, I said, checking my watch. Funny thing about veterans, we're never really alone. You threatening me? Knuckles leaned in, breath stinking of whiskey and bad decisions. Not at all, I replied. Just suggesting you might want to finish your drinks and move along before the bar's front door crashed open with military precision. 5 soldiers in Army combat uniforms entered, not rushing but with purpose. Young, fit, radiating controlled tension. Their eyes scanned the room with professional efficiency before locking onto our table. Grandpa? The tallest one called out. You okay? Frank waved. Over here, Jake. Having a bit of a situation. Jake strode across the bar, accompanied by 2 male and 2 female soldiers. No weapons visible, but they moved with the absolute confidence of trained combatants. This him? Jake asked, stopping in front of Knuckles. At 6'3", Ranger qualified and combat tested. Jake made the biker look small despite their similar builds. This gentleman, Frank said mildly, thought it appropriate to assault Tommy and destroy family photographs. Jake's expression didn't change, but something cold entered his eyes. That right? Knuckles, to his credit, didn't back down immediately. Bar dispute, not your business, soldier boy. See, that's where you're wrong, Jake replied. Tommy served with my grandfather in the Mekong Delta. Saved his life. Twice. He nodded toward me. Jack there was my grandmother's brother's best friend. Bill taught me to shoot when I was 12. His gaze hardened. So this is very much my business. The bar door opened again. More uniforms. 10, then 15, then 20. Men and women, different patches and insignia, filing in quietly. What the hell is this? One of the other bikers demanded. A woman in captain's bars stepped forward. Dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, posture perfect. I'm Captain Wilson, Bill's granddaughter. Got a text there was trouble. Just a few calls, I explained. Word travels fast among military families. The bar had transformed in minutes. Where there had been indifferent civilians looking away, from conflict now stood a wall of uniforms, Army, Marines, Air Force, Navy, young faces with old eyes, veterans from recent wars standing in quiet solidarity with veterans from older ones. Nobody called the cops, Knuckles said, uncertainty creeping into his voice. Didn't need to, Tommy replied, still dabbing blood from his lip. We called family. Captain. Wilson approached our table, kneeling beside Bill. You okay, Grandpa? Bill patted her hand. Fine, Lizzie. Just some excitement to break up the evening. She turned to assess Tommy's injury with professional detachment. Need medical attention, sir? It's Tommy, and no. Had worse shaving. Meanwhile, Jake and 2 other soldiers had positioned themselves between the bikers and our table. Not threatening, not advancing, just standing firm, creating a buffer zone of disciplined muscle and combat experience. Knuckles looked around, realizing how quickly the situation had changed. His crew of 6 now faced at least 30 military personnel, with more arriving by the minute as texts and calls spread through the nearby base. We don't want trouble with the military, he muttered, bravado deflating. Should have thought about that before assaulting decorated veterans, Jake replied. Tommy there has 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. Frank was at Khe Sanh for the entire siege. Bill served 3 tours as a sniper. Jack was a medic who saved more lives than you've probably met in your lifetime. How was I supposed to know? You weren't, Captain Wilson interrupted. That's the point. You saw old men and assumed they were easy targets. Never occurred to you they might be more than their age suggests. The biker with Prospect on his cut, youngest of the group, barely out of his 20s, tugged at Knuckles' arm. Man, let's just go. This ain't worth it. Knuckles shrugged him off, alcohol and pride still overriding good sense. We ain't done nothing illegal. Asshole fell down, that's all. A new voice entered the conversation. The VFW post commander, a retired Marine colonel who'd been watching from the bar's office. "Actually, I have clear video of you assaulting a patron," he said, holding up his phone. "Normally I'd just call the police, but since family is handling it..." He looked at Captain Wilson. "How would you like to proceed, Captain?" She considered for a moment. "I think education might be more valuable than prosecution." The colonel nodded, then addressed the bikers. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to these gentlemen. You're going to pay for any medical attention Tommy needs. You're going to replace the damaged photographs, and you're going to spend tomorrow at the VA hospital, volunteering with wounded warriors. Or," he gestured to his phone, "I send this to the county sheriff and you spend tomorrow in jail." Knuckles looked ready to argue until Jake took a half step forward, his ranger tab visible on his shoulder. "Choose carefully," Jake suggested quietly. The fight visibly drained from Knuckles. "Fine. Sorry about your lip, old-timer. And the pictures." Tommy nodded, accepting the apology with more grace than I would have managed. "Good start," the colonel said. "Now about tomorrow's volunteer session." After the bikers had been escorted out with clear instructions for their community service, the atmosphere in the bar transformed. What had begun as our quiet weekly gathering became an impromptu reunion across generations of warriors. Jake pulled up a chair next to Frank, examining the damaged photographs. "I can get these reprinted, Grandpa. Digital backups, remember?" Frank smiled. "Always prepared, just like I taught you." Across the table, Captain Wilson, Lizzie, was checking Bill's blood pressure. Once a medic before becoming a pilot, she never visited without making sure his health was on track. 35/82, she announced. "Not bad for all the excitement." Bill patted her hand affectionately. "Takes more than bar thugs to rattle me." The other service members had distributed themselves around the VFW, buying drinks, sharing stories, bridging the gaps between wars and generations. A young Marine was listening intently as Tommy described Quezon. 3 Army lieutenants sat captivated by Bill's understated account of sniper operations. I found myself beside a staff sergeant with 3 deployment patches, comparing field medical techniques across decades. "Tourniquets are back in," he explained. "Full circle from your day." "Some lessons get relearned the hard way," I agreed. The colonel pulled up a chair at our table. "Jack, been meaning to ask, you coming to the school's program next month? Need Vietnam vets to talk to the high school kids?" "Still trying to recruit the next generation?" I teased. "Still trying to help them understand sacrifice and service," he corrected. "These kids think history started with 9/11. They need to hear from your generation while they still can." His words hung in the air, the unspoken reality of our dwindling numbers. Tommy broke the momentary silence. "I'll do it, about time I shared some stories." "Me too," Frank added. Bill simply nodded his agreement. I looked around at the unlikely gathering. Gray-haired veterans from conflicts long faded from public memory, sitting alongside young warriors still actively serving. The continuity struck me powerfully, how the thread of service connected us across decades and battlefields. "Count me in," I told the colonel. "Might as well make ourselves useful while we're still vertical." Jake laughed. "Grandpa says you'll outlive us all out, of pure stubbornness." "Your grandpa knows me too well." The night grew late. Younger service members gradually departed, returning to base or homes, each stopping to shake hands or exchange words with us before leaving. The atmosphere of crisis had evolved into something like a family reunion. Tommy, lips swollen but spirit intact, raised his beer. "To absent friends." "Pete sends his regards," I told the group. "Hospice says he's comfortable. Might try to arrange a visit if he's up to it next week." Frank nodded solemnly. "We should go, all of us." The weight of Pete's situation settled around the table, our circle growing smaller, the inevitable march of time that no amount of battlefield courage could halt. Captain Wilson, Lizzie, returned from seeing off the last of her soldiers. She stood behind Bill's chair, hands resting protectively on her grandfather's shoulders. "Need a ride home, Grandpa?" Bill shook his head. "Jake's taking all of us. Monthly tradition. He drives us here. Make sure we get home safe. She bent to kiss his cheek. Good. I'll stop by tomorrow with those medications we talked about. Then to all of us. Gentlemen, it's been an honor. Try to stay out of bar fights for at least a week, please. After she left, we sat in comfortable silence, finishing our drinks. Quite a cavalry response, Tommy mused, touching his swollen lip. Think we overreacted? Proportional response, Bill countered. They had 6, we had 30. Still good tactics, Frank added. Superior numbers, strategic positioning, clear chain of command. I thought about how quickly our text messages had mobilized what amounted to a small military operation, young service members dropping whatever they were doing to rush to the aid of old veterans they might not even know personally. It's more than just family, I said. It's the bond. Jake returned from walking Lizzie to her car. Ready to head out, old-timers? Past your bedtime? Tommy stood, wincing slightly. Watch it, youngster. We can still take you. After what I saw, tonight I believe it, Jake laughed. Then, more seriously, those bikers are lucky you called us instead of handling it yourselves. Bill snorted. We would have won. At your age? Jake raised an eyebrow. Age just means we have less to lose, Bill replied, his sniper's eyes momentarily cold, and more experience hiding bodies. Jake's laugh faltered slightly, unsure if his grandfather's friend was joking. Frank gathered his damp photographs. Don't tease the boy, Bill. As we made our way to the door, the bartender, a veteran himself from the Gulf War era, called out, Same time next week, gentlemen? Wouldn't miss it, I confirmed. Outside, the night air carried a hint of approaching autumn. Jake helped Tommy navigate the steps while Frank and Bill moved with the careful precision of men whose bodies had betrayed their still sharp minds. You know, Jake said as he opened the van door, those bikers will be at the VA hospital tomorrow. Captains arranged for them to spend time with recent amputees and TBI patients. Educational experience. Fitting, Tommy nodded. Though I almost feel sorry for them. The bikers? Jake asked. No. Tommy grinned despite his split lip. The wounded warriors who have to put up with those idiots. We laughed as Jake helped us into the van. Old soldiers being cared for by the generation we'd once protected. The cycle of service and respect continuing, despite a civilian world that often failed to understand either. Next Thursday would find us at the same table, drinking the same cheap beer, sharing the same precious memories. But something had shifted tonight. A reminder that though our bodies had weakened, the brotherhood remained strong. We had fought our wars decades ago in jungles and rice paddies far from home. But tonight's small battle on familiar ground had reaffirmed what we'd always known. Old warriors never truly retire and they never fight alone. The letter from the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association landed on my doorstep like an IED, unexpected, threatening, and capable of destroying everything I'd built. Just like in Fallujah, they wanted to take away what kept me alive. Only this time, it wasn't my weapon. It was my dogs. My name is Marcus Reeves. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and 12 confirmed bomb disposals later, I thought I'd seen the worst humanity had to offer. I was wrong. The worst wasn't in the desert halfway across the world. It was right here in suburban America, wearing khakis and clutching property value spreadsheets. It started 8 months ago when I woke up screaming for the 3rd time that week. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even hold my coffee mug. The nightmares wouldn't stop, the red wire, the blue wire, the ticking clock, the faces of the men and women I couldn't save. My VA-appointed therapist had suggested getting a service dog. Animals can sense when you're about to have an episode, she'd said. They can interrupt the pattern. So I got Zeus, a retired military German shepherd who'd lost his handler to an IED in Kandahar. We were 2 broken soldiers trying to put ourselves back together. Within weeks, my panic attacks decreased by half. I could sleep through most nights. Zeus would press his weight against me when I started to spiral, licking my hand until I came back to the present. Then I started thinking about all the other service dogs out there. the ones who'd lost their handlers or were too old or injured to continue active duty. What happened to them? The answer was ugly. Many were euthanized if they couldn't be rehomed quickly. These dogs had saved countless lives, detected explosives that would have killed entire squads, and provided crucial intelligence. They deserved better than a cold table and a lethal injection. My property in Oak Ridge was modest, but it sat on 2 acres at the edge of the subdivision. I built kennels, installed proper fencing, and converted my garage into a rehabilitation space. Within 3 months, I had 6 former military working dogs besides Zeus. By 6 months, I had 11. These weren't ordinary pets. Each had been rigorously trained by the military. They were disciplined, quiet, and struggling with their own versions of PTSD. Some flinched at loud noises. Others became agitated around certain smells. All of them needed someone who understood. Word spread through veteran networks. Handlers who couldn't keep their partners after discharge would contact me. Military dog trainers connected me with canines too traumatized to continue service. We became a sanctuary. Second tour, I called it. A place where service ended with dignity, not disposal. Everything was running smoothly until Karen Holbrook moved in 4 houses down. Mr. Reeves, it has come to our attention that you are operating an unauthorized kennel business in violation of Oak Ridge Homeowners Association bylaws, specifically Section 7.2 regarding residential-only usage and Section 9.4 limiting households to 2 domestic pets. The letter was signed by Theodore Winfield, HOA president, but I knew whose manicured hand was really behind it. I'd met Karen at the neighborhood barbecue last month. Her pearl earrings bobbed as she interrogated me about all those dogs she'd seen on my property. When I explained what second tour was, her smile tightened. How noble, she'd said, glancing pointedly at the scar running down my cheek. But surely there are more appropriate locations for such an enterprise. The barking must be dreadful. They don't bark much, ma'am, I'd replied. They're military trained. Discipline is in their blood. Still, she'd insisted, property values are a concern for all of us, and allergies. Did you know my daughter is severely allergic? I later learned that Karen's daughter was away at college in California and hadn't set foot in Oak Ridge in years. The letter continued. You have 30 days to remedy this violation or face an initial fine of $100 per day, per animal exceeding the limit. With 11 dogs, that would amount to $900 daily after the grace period. I was surviving on my military pension and disability payments. I couldn't afford that. Not even close. I crumpled the letter in my fist, feeling my heart rate spike. Zeus immediately pressed against my leg, sensing the change. Through the window, I could see Karen walking her tiny Pomeranian, deliberately slowing as she passed my house. This was war. And if there's one thing a veteran knows, it's that you don't win wars alone. My first ally was unexpected. Sasha Petrov lived across the street, a quiet woman who rarely engaged with neighbors beyond a polite nod. I'd noticed her watching the two dogs sometimes when I exercised them in the yard, but she'd never approached. Until now. I received same letter, she said, the morning after the HOA notice arrived. Her Russian accent was still thick despite years in America. About my chickens. 3 chickens only, but Karen, she complains about smell. There is no smell. She never even comes to my yard. Sasha, it turned out, was a former software engineer who now worked remotely. More importantly, she knew how to research. HOA bylaws are public record, she explained as we sat at my kitchen table. And minutes from meetings. I find interesting things. Those interesting things included the fact that Theodore Winfield had approved an extension to his own deck that violated setback requirements, and Karen Holbrook had installed unapproved landscaping last spring. The rules, it seemed, bent for some, but remained rigid for others. By the end of the week, we had 5 more neighbors with similar stories. Miguel Sanchez had been fined for his work truck parked in his driveway overnight, despite working emergency plumbing repairs. Elderly Mrs. Whitaker had received warnings about her unsightly wheelchair ramp, which she'd installed after her hip replacement. The foster family had been threatened over their autistic son's therapeutic trampoline. We gathered in my living room on Saturday, surrounded by the calm presence of my canine charges. Zeus rested his head on Miguel's knee, somehow sensing the plumber's recent back injury. Aries, a chocolate lab who'd survived 3 roadside bombs, sat alertly by Mrs. Whitaker's side. "They behave better than most people," Mrs. Whitaker observed, patting Aries gently. "That's the point," I said. "These aren't just pets. They've served our country, saved lives. Now they're helping veterans heal. Some of these dogs suffered injuries in the line of duty." I gestured to Apollo, a Belgian Malinois missing his left front leg after a firefight in Helmand Province. "What the HOA is doing isn't just unfair, it's disrespectful to their service." "But what can we do?" Miguel asked. "The HOA has the legal right to enforce these rules. We all signed the agreements when we bought our homes." That's when Sasha smiled. "Maybe yes, maybe no. I make some calls. There is someone you should meet." James Connor was the antithesis of what I expected in a lawyer. No suit, no slick haircut, no leather briefcase. Instead, he showed up in worn jeans, a faded Marines t-shirt, and a prosthetic leg that he didn't bother to conceal. "Fallujah, 2004, he said, catching my glance at the prosthetic. "Stepped on something I shouldn't have. You?" "EOD, I replied. "Bomb disposal, same places, different jobs." He nodded, understanding immediately. "So I hear you've got yourself an HOA problem, and some 4-legged veterans needing protection." We walked through the facility I'd built, and James watched as the dogs went through their daily routines. He observed how Apollo, despite his missing leg, still performed perimeter checks with military precision. How Athena, a German shepherd who'd been trapped in rubble for 3 days after an explosion, now helped me demonstrate calm behavior for dogs with more severe trauma. "This isn't a kennel," James said finally. "This is rehabilitation, therapy, and that changes everything." Back inside, he spread out papers across my dining table. "There are 3 things working in your favor," he explained. "First, the FAIR Housing Act protects service animals, and these qualify even if they're not directly servicing you. Second, the PACT Act passed last year includes provisions for the welfare of retired military working dogs. And third," he grinned, "your HOA is sloppy with its own procedures." He pointed to a clause in the bylaws. "Changes to animal restrictions require a 2/3 majority vote from all homeowners, not just board members. I've reviewed the meeting minutes for the past 5 years. They never held such a vote when they reduced the pet limit from 3 to 2 animals last year." Hope flickered in my chest. "So what do we do?" "We could fight them on procedural grounds, but that's just a temporary fix. They'd correct their mistake and come after you again." James leaned back. "No, we need a more permanent solution. We need to change the rules altogether." The next month was a blur of activity. James helped me file for official recognition as a rehabilitation facility for service animals, which would exempt Second Tour from being classified as a kennel business. Sasha built a website documenting each dog's military service and their ongoing journey. But our masterstroke came from an unlikely source. Mrs. Whitaker's grandson, a journalism student at the State University, wrote an article about Second Tour that got picked up by the local paper. Soon a regional TV station wanted to do a feature. The day the TV crew arrived, I made sure everything was immaculate. The dogs performed their training demonstrations flawlessly, showing off their discipline and the critical skills that had saved so many lives overseas. "And what about the neighbors?" the reporter asked. "Any complaints about noise or disturbances? Why don't you ask them yourself?" I gestured to where Sasha, Miguel, Mrs. Whitaker, and a dozen other neighbors stood, ready with testimonials about how Second Tour had actually improved the neighborhood. The reporter seemed impressed, but I couldn't help noticing Karen Holbrook, watching from the edge of the gathering, her face pinched with displeasure. This battle was far from over. The feature aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Veterans organizations, animal welfare groups, and ordinary citizens wanted to know how they could help. Donations flooded the website Sasha had created. Local businesses offered supplies and support. More crucially, Homeowners within Oak Ridge who'd never spoken to me before were suddenly introducing themselves, expressing support, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach. The HOA board called an emergency meeting for the following Tuesday. They didn't invite me, but James had anticipated this move. They're going to try to rush through a more specific prohibition, he warned. We need to be ready. We spent the weekend gathering signatures for our counter-proposal, an amendment to the HOA bylaws that would create a specific exemption for rehabilitation facilities for service animals, particularly those with military backgrounds. Tuesday evening arrived, and the Oak Ridge Community Center was packed beyond capacity. Board President Theodore Winfield looked uncomfortable as he called the meeting to order, eyeing the unusual crowd with suspicion. We have a single agenda item tonight, he announced. A proposed amendment to clarify the pet restrictions in light of recent situations. Karen Holbrook stood, clutching a folder of papers. As the chair of the Community Standards Committee, I've drafted language that would explicitly prohibit the operation of animal kennels, shelters, or similar facilities, regardless of their claimed purpose. She emphasized claimed with obvious disdain. This will protect our property values and community character from inappropriate. Point of order. James Connor rose from his seat near the back. Despite his casual attire, his voice carried the authority of the courtroom. Before the board considers new restrictions, there's the matter of the existing pet limit reduction that was implemented without the required 2/3 homeowner vote last year. Murmurs spread through the room. Theodore Winfield shifted uncomfortably. And you are? James Connor, attorney representing Marcus Reeves, and second to a rehabilitation facility. He moved to the front of the room. I've reviewed all HOA proceedings for the past 5 years. The vote to reduce the pet limit from 3 to 2 animals was conducted with only board members present, in direct violation of your own bylaws. Article 4, Section 3. The murmurs grew louder. Theodore tried to regain control. This is an inappropriate forum to raise such concerns. If Mr. Reeves wishes to dispute his violation, there's a formal appeals process. I'm not disputing the violation, I said, standing up. I'm challenging the legitimacy of the rule itself. James distributed copies of our counter-proposal to each board member. We have signatures from 157 Oak Ridge homeowners, well over the 2/3 majority required, supporting this amendment, to create an exemption for service animal rehabilitation facilities with proper certification. Karen Holbrook's face flushed crimson. This is absurd. You can't just change the rules because you don't like them. Actually, James replied calmly, that's exactly how democratic governance works. And since proper procedure wasn't followed for the pet limit reduction, we're also requesting that any fines or violations based on that invalid rule be immediately rescinded. The room erupted in applause. Theodore Winfield pounded his gavel, trying desperately to restore order. This is irregular, he sputtered. We need time to review these documents. Consult our own legal counsel. Of course, James agreed. In the meantime, since the legitimacy of the rule is in question, no enforcement actions should be taken against Second Tour or any other residents with more than 2 pets. Theodore looked like he wanted to object, but seemed to realize he was outmaneuvered. We'll take it under advisement. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a reprieve. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors I barely knew came up to shake my hand, pat my back, offer encouragement. For the first time since leaving the military, I felt part of something larger than myself again. Karen Holbrook wasn't finished. 2 days after the meeting, a county animal control officer showed up at my door, citing anonymous complaints about dangerous animals and unsanitary conditions. The inspection, however, backfired spectacularly. The officer, a former Army Ranger, himself, was impressed by the facility and the dog's behavior. He left with brochures about Second Tour and a promise to refer veterans he knew who might benefit from our program. Next came code enforcement, investigating claims of unauthorized construction. They found all my permits in order. James had made sure of that. The pressure continued, but so did our momentum. A local construction company offered to build proper kennels and a training area at cost. A veterinary clinic provided free checkups and care for all the dogs. The regional TV station did a follow-up story, focusing on the HOA conflict and the community's response. Public opinion was solidly in our favor, but Karen and Theodore still controlled the HOA board. They delayed voting on our amendment, cited procedural concerns, and made increasingly technical arguments about zoning and residential definitions. "They're stalling," James observed after yet another inconclusive board meeting, "hoping we'll lose steam or make a mistake." "So what's our next move?" I asked. He smiled grimly. "Nuclear option. We force a recall election of the entire board." The recall petition spread through Oak Ridge like wildfire. Years of accumulated resentment against the HOA's petty enforcement and selective rule application fueled its momentum. Within 2 weeks, we had signatures from over 75% of homeowners. The day we submitted the petition, Theodore Winfield called an emergency session of the board to finally vote on our amendment. Suddenly, they were eager to appear reasonable, to show they were listening to community concerns. Too late. We declined to withdraw the recall petition. The amendment vote was merely a tactical retreat. We wanted strategic victory. The recall election was scheduled for a month later. During that time, Second Tour held an open house every weekend. Neighbors who had never visited could see firsthand what we were doing. Veterans brought their families to meet the dogs that had served alongside them in combat zones. Apollo, with his three-legged determination, became something of a local celebrity. Children asked to pet him, and he would sit patiently, his military bearing softened by gentle eyes. Athena demonstrated how she could detect signs of anxiety and provide calming pressure. Zeus showed how he could guide a disoriented person to safety. These weren't just dogs, they were heroes continuing their service in a different way. And the community began to see them that way too. Election day arrived. The community center was transformed into a polling station, with volunteers checking names against the homeowner roster. Theodore and Karen had mounted a desperate campaign focusing on property values and appropriate uses for residential areas, but their arguments felt hollow against the reality of what Second Tour represented. The votes were counted that evening. The result was decisive. All 5 board members recalled to be replaced by a new slate that included Miguel Sanchez, Sasha Petrov, and 3 other neighbors who supported our cause. Karen Holbrook stormed out before the final tally was announced. Theodore Winfield stayed, his face grim but resigned. "You know," he said to me as people celebrated around us, "I never had anything against your dogs personally. I was just trying to follow the rules." "That's the problem," I replied. "Sometimes, the rules need to follow what's right, not the other way around." 6 months later, Second Tour had expanded to include a visiting program, where our rehabilitated service dogs visited the local VA hospital, bringing comfort to veterans still struggling with their own wounds, both visible and hidden. Our amendment had passed unanimously under the new board, creating not just an exemption for Second Tour, but a framework for other service-oriented activities within the community. Property values hadn't plummeted. In fact, homes in Oak Ridge were now marketed as part of a veteran-friendly community with unique amenities. Karen Holbrook put her house up for sale 3 weeks after the election. The new owners, coincidentally, were a young couple, the husband a Marine recently returned from overseas. They had a service dog of their own, a Springer Spaniel named Liberty, who had detected explosives in Syria. Today, as I watch Apollo teaching their children how to give proper commands, I think about the strange battlefield I found myself fighting on after returning home. Not sand and mountains, but suburban streets and community centers. Not against insurgents, but against indifference and bureaucracy. Different battlefield, same mission, protecting those who served, ensuring no one gets left behind. Through the window, I can see Zeus patrolling the perimeter of our property, not because he needs to, but because old habits die hard. I understand completely. We're both still on duty in our way. The war might be over for us, but the service never really ends. It just finds a new mission, a new purpose. And sometimes, that purpose is right in your own backyard. I reach for my phone as it buzzes with a text message. Another retired military dog needing placement. Another chance to continue the mission. Roger that, I reply. Send them home to us. Home. That's what Second Tour has become. Not just for the dogs, but for me. A place where service continues. Wounds heal and battles worth fighting are won one day at a time. I whistle for Zeus. Time for our evening rounds, checking on each of our charges. The mission continues, and this time, we have the whole neighborhood watching our six. The letter from the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association landed on my doorstep like an IED, unexpected, threatening, and capable of destroying everything I'd built. Just like in Fallujah, they wanted to take away what kept me alive. Only this time, it wasn't my weapon. It was my dogs. My name is Marcus Reeves. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and 12 confirmed bomb disposals later, I thought I'd seen the worst humanity had to offer. I was wrong. The worst wasn't in the desert halfway across the world, it was right here in suburban America, wearing khakis and clutching property value spreadsheets. It started 8 months ago when I woke up screaming for the 3rd time that week. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even hold my coffee mug. The nightmares wouldn't stop. The red wire, the blue wire, the ticking clock. The faces of the men and women I couldn't save. My VA-appointed therapist had suggested getting a service dog. Animals can sense when you're about to have an episode, she'd said. They can interrupt the pattern. So I got Zeus, a retired military German shepherd who'd lost his handler to an IED in Kandahar. We were 2 broken soldiers trying to put ourselves back together. Within weeks, my panic attacks decreased by half. I could sleep through most nights. Zeus would press his weight against me when I started to spiral, licking my hand until I came back to the present. Then I started thinking about all the other service dogs out there, the ones who'd lost their handlers or were too old or injured to continue active duty. What happened to them? The answer was ugly. Many were euthanized if they couldn't be rehomed quickly. These dogs had saved countless lives, detected explosives that would have killed entire squads, and provided crucial intelligence. They deserved better than a cold table and a lethal injection. My property in Oak Ridge was modest, but it sat on 2 acres at the edge of the subdivision. I built kennels, installed proper fencing, and converted my garage into a rehabilitation space. Within 3 months, I had 6 former military working dogs besides Zeus. By 6 months, I had 11. These weren't ordinary pets. Each had been rigorously trained by the military. They were disciplined, quiet, and struggling with their own versions of PTSD. Some flinched at loud noises. Others became agitated around certain smells. All of them needed someone who understood. Word spread through veteran networks. Handlers who couldn't keep their partners after discharge would contact me. Military dog trainers connected me with canines too traumatized to continue service. We became a sanctuary. Second Tour, I called it. A place where service ended with dignity, not disposal. Everything was running smoothly until Karen Holbrook moved in 4 houses down. Mr. Reeves, it has come to our attention that you are operating an unauthorized kennel business in violation of Oak Ridge Homeowners Association bylaws, specifically Section 7.2 regarding residential-only usage and Section 9.4 limiting households to 2 domestic pets. The letter was signed by Theodore Winfield, HOA president, but I knew whose manicured hand was really behind it. I'd met Karen at the neighborhood barbecue last month. Her pearl earrings bobbed as she interrogated me about all those dogs she'd seen on my property. When I explained what Second Tour was, her smile tightened. How noble, she'd said, glancing pointedly at the scar running down my cheek. But surely there are more appropriate locations for such an enterprise. The barking must be dreadful. They don't bark much, ma'am, I'd replied. They're military trained. Discipline is in their blood. Still, she'd insisted, property values are a concern for all of us, and allergies. Did you know my daughter is severely allergic? I later learned that Karen's daughter was away at college in California and hadn't set foot in Oak Ridge in years. The letter continued. You have 30 days to remedy this violation or face an initial fine of $100 per day per animal exceeding the limit. With 11 dogs, that would amount to $900 daily after the grace period. I was surviving on my military pension and disability payments. I couldn't afford that, not even close. I crumpled the letter in my fist, feeling my heart rate spike. Zeus immediately pressed against my leg, sensing the change. Through the window I could see Karen walking her tiny Pomeranian, deliberately slowing as she passed my house. This was war. And if there's one thing a veteran knows, it's that you don't win wars alone. My first ally was unexpected. Sasha Petrov lived across the street, a quiet woman who rarely engaged with neighbors beyond a polite nod. I'd noticed her watching the dogs sometimes when I exercised them in the yard, but she'd never approached until now. I received same letter, she said, the morning after the HOA notice arrived. Her Russian accent was still thick despite years in America. About my chickens, 3 chickens only, but Karen, she complains about smell. There is no smell. She never even comes to my yard. Sasha, it turned out, was a former software engineer who now worked remotely. More importantly, she knew how to research. HOA bylaws, our public record, she explained as we sat at my kitchen table. And minutes from meetings. I find interesting things. Those interesting things included the fact that Theodore Winfield had approved an extension to his own deck that violated setback requirements, and Karen Holbrook had installed unapproved landscaping last spring. The rules, it seemed, bent for some but remained rigid for others. By the end of the week, we had 5 more neighbors with similar stories. Miguel Sanchez had been fined for his work truck parked in his driveway overnight, despite working emergency plumbing repairs. Elderly Mrs. Whitaker had received warnings about her unsightly wheelchair ramp, which she'd installed after her hip replacement. The Foster family had been threatened over their autistic son's therapeutic trampoline. We gathered, in my living room on Saturday, surrounded by the calm presence of my canine charges. Zeus rested his head on Miguel's knee, somehow sensing the plumber's recent back injury. Aries, a chocolate lab who'd survived 3 roadside bombs, sat alertly by Mrs. Whitaker's side. They behave better than most people, Mrs. Whitaker observed, patting Aries gently. That's the point, I said. These aren't just pets. They've served our country, saved lives. Now they're helping veterans heal. Some of these dogs suffered injuries in the line of duty. I gestured to Apollo, a Belgian Malinois missing his left front leg after a firefight in Helmand Province. What the HOA is doing isn't just unfair, it's disrespectful to their service. But what can we do? Miguel asked. The HOA has the legal right to enforce these rules. We all signed the agreements when we bought our homes. That's when Sasha smiled. Maybe yes, maybe no. I make some calls. There is someone you should meet. James Connor was the antithesis of what I expected in a lawyer. No suit, no slick haircut, no leather briefcase. Instead, he showed up in worn jeans, a faded Marines t-shirt, and a prosthetic leg that he didn't bother to conceal. Fallujah, 2004, he said, catching my glance at the prosthetic. Stepped on something I shouldn't have. You? EOD, I replied. Bomb disposal, same places, different jobs. He nodded, understanding immediately. So I hear you've got yourself an HOA problem and some 4-legged veterans needing protection. We walked through the facility I'd built, and James watched as the dogs went through their daily routines. He observed how Apollo, despite his missing leg, still performed perimeter checks with military precision. How Athena, a German shepherd who'd been trapped in rubble for 3 days after an explosion, now helped me demonstrate calm behavior for dogs with more severe trauma. This isn't a kennel, James said finally. This is rehabilitation, therapy, and that changes everything. Back inside, he spread out papers across my dining table. There are 3 things working in your favor, he explained. First, the FAIR. Housing Act protects service animals, and these qualify even if they're not directly servicing you. Second, the PACT Act passed last year includes provisions for the welfare of retired military working dogs. And third, he grinned, your HOA is sloppy with its own procedures. He pointed to a clause in the bylaws. Changes to animal restrictions require a 2/3 majority vote from all homeowners, not just board members. I've reviewed the meeting minutes for the past 5 years. They never held such a vote when they reduced the pet limit from 3 to 2 animals last year. Hope flickered in my chest. So what do we do? We could fight them on procedural grounds, but that's just a temporary fix. They'd correct their mistake and come after you again. James leaned back. No, we need a more permanent solution. We need to change the rules altogether. The next month was a blur of activity. James helped me file for official recognition as a rehabilitation facility for service animals, which would exempt Second Tour from being classified as a kennel business. Sasha built a website documenting each dog's military service and their ongoing journey. But our masterstroke came from an unlikely source. Mrs. Whitaker's grandson, a journalism student at the State University, wrote an article about Second Tour that got picked up by the local paper. Soon a regional TV station wanted to do a feature. The day the TV crew arrived, I made sure everything was immaculate. The dogs performed their training demonstrations flawlessly, showing off their discipline and the critical skills that had saved so many lives overseas. And what about the neighbors? The reporter asked. Any complaints about noise or disturbances? Why don't you ask them yourself? I gestured to where Sasha, Miguel, Mrs. Whitaker, and a dozen other neighbors stood, ready with testimonials about how Second Tour had actually improved the neighborhood. The reporter seemed impressed, but I couldn't help noticing Karen Holbrook watching from the edge of the gathering, her face pinched with displeasure. This battle was far from over. The feature aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Veterans organizations, animal welfare groups, and ordinary citizens wanted to know how they could help. Donations flooded the website Sasha had created. Local businesses offered supplies and support. More crucially, homeowners within Oak Ridge who'd never spoken to me before were suddenly introducing themselves, expressing support, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach. The HOA board called an emergency meeting for the following Tuesday. They didn't invite me, but James had anticipated this move. They're going to try to rush through a more specific prohibition, he warned. We need to be ready. We spent the weekend gathering signatures for our counter-proposal, an amendment to the HOA bylaws that would create a specific exemption for rehabilitation facilities for service animals, particularly those with military backgrounds. Tuesday evening arrived, and the Oak Ridge Community Center was packed beyond capacity. Board. President Theodore Winfield looked uncomfortable as he called the meeting to order, eyeing the unusual crowd with suspicion. We have a single agenda item tonight, he announced. A proposed amendment to clarify the pet restrictions in light of recent situations. Karen Holbrook stood, clutching a folder of papers. As the chair of the Community Standards Committee, I've drafted language that would explicitly prohibit the operation of animal kennels, shelters, or similar facilities regardless of their claimed purpose. She emphasized claimed with obvious disdain. This will protect our property values and community character from inappropriate. Point of order. James Connor rose from his seat near the back. Despite his casual attire, his voice carried the authority of the courtroom. Before the board considers new restrictions, there's the matter of the existing pet limit reduction that was implemented without the required 2/3 homeowner vote last year. Murmurs spread through the room. Theodore Winfield shifted uncomfortably. And you are? James Connor, attorney representing Marcus Reeves and Second Tour Rehabilitation Facility. He moved to the front of the room. I've reviewed all HOA proceedings for the past 5 years. The vote to reduce the pet limit from 3 to 2 animals was conducted with only board members present, in direct violation of your own bylaws, Article 4, Section 3. The murmurs grew louder. Theodore tried to regain control. This is an inappropriate forum to raise such concerns. If Mr. Reeves wishes to dispute his violation, there's a formal appeals process. I'm not disputing the violation, I said, standing up. I'm challenging the legitimacy of the rule itself. James distributed copies of our counter-proposal to each board member. We have signatures from 157 Oak Ridge homeowners, well over the 2/3 majority required, supporting this amendment to create an exemption for service animal rehabilitation facilities with proper certification. Karen Holbrook's face flushed crimson. This is absurd. You can't just change the rules because you don't like them. Actually, James replied calmly, That's exactly how democratic governance works. And since proper procedure wasn't followed for the pet limit reduction, we're also requesting that any fines or violations based on that invalid rule be immediately rescinded. The room erupted in applause. Theodore Winfield pounded his gavel, trying desperately to restore order. "This is irregular," he sputtered. "We need time to review these documents, consult our own legal counsel." "Of course," James agreed. "In the meantime, since the legitimacy of the rule is in question, no enforcement actions should be taken against Second Tour or any other residents with more than 2 pets. Theodore looked like he wanted to object, but seemed to realize he was outmaneuvered. "We'll take it under advisement." It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a reprieve. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors I barely knew came up to shake my hand, pat my back, offer encouragement. For the first time since leaving the military, I felt part of something larger than myself again. Karen Holbrook wasn't finished. 2 days after the meeting, a county animal control officer showed up at my door, citing anonymous complaints about dangerous animals and unsanitary conditions. The inspection, however, backfired spectacularly. The officer, a former Army Ranger, himself was impressed by the facility and the dog's behavior. He left with brochures about Second Tour and a promise to refer veterans he knew who might benefit from our program. Next came code enforcement, investigating claims of unauthorized construction. They found all my permits in order. James had made sure of that. The pressure continued, but so did our momentum. A local construction company offered to build proper kennels and a training area at cost. A veterinary clinic provided free checkups and care for all the dogs. The regional TV station did a follow-up story, focusing on the HOA conflict and the community's response. Public opinion was solidly in our favor, but Karen and Theodore still controlled the HOA board. They delayed voting on our amendment, cited procedural concerns, and made increasingly technical arguments about zoning and residential definitions. "They're stalling," James observed after yet another inconclusive board meeting, "hoping we'll lose steam or make a mistake." "So what's our next move?" I asked. He smiled grimly. "Nuclear option. We force a recall election of the entire board." The recall petition spread through Oak Ridge like wildfire. Years of accumulated resentment against the HOA's petty enforcement and selective rule application fueled its momentum. Within 2 weeks, we had signatures from over 75% of homeowners. The day we submitted the petition, Theodore Winfield called an emergency session of the board to finally vote on our amendment. Suddenly, they were eager to appear reasonable, to show they were listening to community concerns. Too late. We declined to withdraw the recall petition. The amendment vote was merely a tactical retreat. We wanted strategic victory. The recall election was scheduled for a month later. During that time, Second Tour held an open house every weekend. Neighbors who had never visited could see firsthand what we were doing. Veterans brought their families to meet the dogs that had served, alongside them in combat zones. Apollo, with his 3-legged determination, became something of a local celebrity. Children asked to pet him, and he would sit patiently, his military bearing softened by gentle eyes. Athena demonstrated how she could detect signs of anxiety and provide calming pressure. Zeus showed how he could guide a disoriented person to safety. These weren't just dogs. They were heroes continuing their service in a different way, and the community began to see them that way too. Election day arrived. The community center was transformed into a polling station with volunteers checking names against the homeowner roster. Theodore and Karen had mounted a desperate campaign focusing on property values and appropriate uses for residential areas, but their arguments felt hollow against the reality of what Second Tour represented. The votes were counted that evening. The result was decisive. All 5 board members recalled, to be replaced by a new slate that included Miguel Sanchez, Sasha Petrov, and 3 other neighbors who supported our cause. Karen Holbrook stormed out before the final tally was announced. Theodore Winfield stayed, his face grim but resigned. "You know," he said to me as people celebrated around us, "I never had anything against your dogs personally. I was just trying to follow the rules." That's the problem, I replied. Sometimes, the rules need to follow what's right, not the other way around. 6 months later, second tour had expanded to include a visiting program where our rehabilitated service dogs visited the local VA hospital, bringing comfort to veterans still struggling with their own wounds, both visible and hidden. Our amendment had passed unanimously under the new board, creating not just an exemption for second tour, but a framework for other service-oriented activities within the community. Property values hadn't plummeted. In fact, homes in Oak Ridge were now marketed as part of a veteran-friendly community with unique amenities. Karen Holbrook put her house up for sale 3 weeks after the election. The new owners, coincidentally, were a young couple. The husband, a Marine, recently returned from overseas. They had a service dog of their own, a Springer Spaniel named Liberty who had detected explosives in Syria. Today, as I watch Apollo teaching their children how to give proper commands, I think about the strange battlefield I found myself fighting on after returning home. Not sand and mountains, but suburban streets and community centers. Not against insurgents, but against indifference and bureaucracy. Different battlefield, same mission. Protecting those who served, ensuring no one gets left behind. Through the window, I can see Zeus patrolling the perimeter of our property, not because he needs to, but because old habits die hard. I understand completely. We're both still on duty, in our way. The war might be over for us, but the service never really ends. It just finds a new mission, a new purpose. And sometimes, that purpose is right in your own backyard. I reach for my phone as it buzzes with a text message. Another retired military dog needing placement. Another chance to continue the mission. Roger that, I reply. Send them home to us. Home. That's what second tour has become. Not just for the dogs, but for me. A place where service continues, wounds heal, and battles worth fighting are won one day at a time. I whistle for Zeus. Time for our evening rounds, checking on each of our charges. The mission continues. And this time, we have the whole neighborhood watching our 6. The fuel gauge needle trembled just above empty as hurricane-force winds slammed against the helicopter's frame. I had exactly 2 choices. Follow orders and turn back, saving myself and my crew, or descend into hell to rescue 3 stranded paramedics and their critical patients. The radio crackled with my supervisor's final warning. Jackson, you return to base now or don't bother coming back at all. I killed the radio. Some decisions aren't really decisions at all. When you've pulled bleeding Marines from hot zones while bullets pinged off your bird's underbelly, the math becomes simple. Lives outweigh rules. Every time. My name is Captain Daniel Jackson, and this is how I lost everything I'd rebuilt and found something worth far more. The first signs of hurricane. Eliza appeared on weather radars 8 days earlier. Just another tropical depression spinning off the African coast, they said. Nothing to worry about. By day 3, it had swallowed enough warm Atlantic water to become something monstrous. By day 5, evacuation orders blanketed Florida's Gulf Coast. I'd been flying air ambulance helicopters for Medilift emergency services for nearly 3 years by then. After 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Black Hawk pilot, civilian life had felt hollow, purposeless. Flying critical patients through stormy nights gave me back that essential feeling that what I did mattered. That lives depended on my skill, my judgment, my nerve. Medilift operated out of Tampa General, with a fleet of 6 emergency response helicopters serving the greater Tampa Bay area. Our director, Lawrence Brenner, ran the operation with corporate precision. Former military himself, Air Force, which explained a lot. He believed in protocols, hierarchies, and the unquestionable authority of the chain of command. We're not cowboys here, Jackson, he'd warned during my interview. We operate by the book or not at all. I'd nodded, agreeing to his face while thinking of all the times the book would have left good people dead in the dust of Kandahar province. But I needed the job, needed to fly, needed to matter again. So I smiled and played along. For 3 years, I'd kept my mouth shut when decisions seemed questionable. I'd filed flight plans exactly as required. I'd maintained the precise fuel reserves mandated by company policy. I'd become the model employee, decorated veteran turned reliable civilian, until Hurricane Eliza changed everything. The morning of the hurricane's landfall, I woke before dawn to the sound of rain hammering against my apartment windows. The wind already howled through Tampa's streets, toppling trash cans and sending debris skittering across pavement. My phone buzzed with an emergency alert. All non-essential personnel ordered to evacuate or shelter in place. I wasn't non-essential. At the hospital helipad, chaos reigned. Nurses rushed last-minute transfers into waiting ambulances. Doctors argued, over-triage priorities. My crew, Elena Rodriguez, flight nurse extraordinaire, and Marcus Chen, the best paramedic I'd ever worked with, were already prepping our bird, a Eurocopter EC-145. Brenner intercepted me before I could reach them. "You've got 3 hours maximum," he said, rainwater streaming down his face despite the shelter of the helipad awning. "After that, I'm grounding all flights. This storm's accelerating faster than predicted. Category 4 now, possible 5 by nightfall." "Understood," I replied, though I was already calculating how many runs we could squeeze in. 3 hours wouldn't be enough. "I mean it, Jackson. When I call you back, you come back. No heroics." I gave him my most obedient nod and headed for the helicopter. Elena raised an eyebrow as I climbed into the pilot's seat. "He giving you the no heroics speech again? Does he have any other speeches?" I adjusted my headset and began pre-flight checks. "He's got the 'I'm not paying overtime' one," Marcus chimed in from the back, "and the 'file your paperwork on time' classic." Despite the storm raging around us, I felt that familiar calm settle over me, the clarity that came with purpose. We had a job to do. People needed us. Everything else was just noise. For the first 2 hours, we ferried critical patients from smaller facilities in the path of the storm to Tampa General and other inland hospitals. The wind grew stronger with each run, the rain heavier, visibility worse. But the EC-145 was a sturdy bird, and I'd flown through worse in the Hindu Kush. Then came the call that changed everything. "Medilift 1, this is Bayshore Community Medical Center. We have multiple critical patients requiring immediate evacuation. Building damage sustained, power failing, requesting immediate assistance." I checked our fuel gauge, 65% remaining. Enough for the trip to Bayshore and back with the standard 30% reserve. I glanced at the navigation screen. Bayshore sat directly in the hurricane's path in a mandatory evacuation zone. "Dispatch, this is Medilift 1. We copy Bayshore's request and are en route." The dispatcher's voice crackled with static. "Be advised, Medilift 1, you're approaching your recall time. Director Brenner has ordered all units back to base in 20 minutes. Copy that, dispatch. We'll make it quick." Elena shot me a look. We both knew quick wouldn't be possible, not with multiple critical patients to load and transport through deteriorating conditions. "Your call, Captain," she said quietly. "Some people think courage means never feeling fear. They're wrong. Courage is feeling the fear and making the right choice anyway." As the helicopter banked toward Bayshore, my mouth went dry and my heart pounded against my ribs. Not from fear of the storm, but from what awaited when we returned. If we returned. The scene at Bayshore was apocalyptic. Part of the roof had collapsed. Ambulances were stranded in the flooded parking lot. Medical staff waved frantically from the helipad, hunched against the driving rain. I brought the EC-145 down with a gentleness belying the violence of the wind. The moment we touched down, Elena and Marcus leapt out, running toward the waiting staff. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I watched them conferring, saw Elena's gestures growing more animated. When they returned, Marcus's face told me everything. 5 critical patients, he shouted over the roar of the rotors and wind. 2 ventilator-dependent, 1 pediatric trauma, plus 3 paramedics stranded when their ambulance flooded. "We can take 4 max," I replied. Our helicopter wasn't designed for such a load. Elena's eyes met mine. "They say the building's not going to last the night. The rest of the evac vehicles can't get through the flooding." My radio crackled. Medilift 1, this is Director Brenner. Return to base immediately. Repeat. Immediate recall. Storm surge accelerating beyond projections. I stared at the fuel gauge, at the radar showing the hurricane's eye wall approaching, at the desperate faces of the medical staff on the helipad. Medilift 1, acknowledge recall order. I picked up the radio. Negative dispatch, we have critical patients requiring evacuation, proceeding with loading. That is a direct order, Jackson. The window for safe return is closing. Then I'll find another window. I switched off the radio. Elena's hand touched my shoulder. Dan, if we take all of them, we won't have enough fuel to make it back to Tampa General. I know, I said. That's why we're not going to Tampa General. We overloaded the helicopter with 5 patients plus 3 paramedics in addition to our crew. The EC-145 groaned as we lifted off, straining against the wind and the extra weight. I'd never pushed a civilian aircraft so hard. Instead of heading back to Tampa, I turned northwest, toward a small regional airport where I knew we could refuel. It would be tight, dangerously tight, but possible. Elena worked furiously in the back, stabilizing patients alongside Marcus and the Bayshore paramedics. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, kept glancing fearfully at the pediatric patient, a boy of about 8 with a broken arm and possible internal injuries. He's going to make it, I heard her promise the child. Our pilot's the best. He got shot down in Afghanistan and still landed safely. Not quite true. We'd taken heavy fire but never actually been shot down. But I appreciated the vote of confidence. The regional airport came into view just as our fuel warning light began to flash. The landing wasn't pretty, more of a controlled crash than a proper touchdown, but we made it. Airport staff rushed out with fuel trucks while we transferred patients to waiting ambulances. The boy with the broken arm grabbed my sleeve as they loaded him. "You fly like in the video games," he said, his face pale but eyes bright with adrenaline. "Better," I winked. "In video games, you get extra lives." Once the patients were safely away, we refueled and headed back out. By now, the hurricane's full fury had engulfed the coast. Flying became a brutal negotiation between machine and nature, with little margin for error. Twice, downdrafts nearly slammed us into the ground. The helicopter's frame shuddered with each gust, instruments flickering. When we finally reached Tampa General, Brenner was waiting on the helipad, face contorted with fury even through the sheeting rain. I cut the engines and stepped out, legs wobbly with exhaustion. "In my office," he shouted over the wind. "Now!" "You disobeyed a direct order." Brenner's voice was dangerously quiet as he paced behind his desk. "You endangered yourself, your crew, and company equipment worth millions. You violated FAA regulations on flight time during severe weather events." I stood at attention, old, military habits resurfacing. "Yes, sir." "Don't sir me, Jackson. This isn't the Army. You can't just go rogue when you feel like it. With respect, Director, those people would have died. That's not your call to make." His fist slammed onto the desk. "We have protocols for a reason. Risk assessments, chain of command. Without them, we're just cowboys with helicopters." Elena stepped forward. She and Marcus had insisted on joining me for this dressing down. "The protocols would have left 8 people to die, sir." Brenner's glare could have melted steel. "I'm not debating this. You're suspended pending review, Jackson. Turn in your credentials." My hands didn't shake as I unclipped my Medilift ID and placed it on his desk. 10 years in the military had taught me to mask emotion, to lock it away where it couldn't interfere with the mission. But inside, something broke. Flying wasn't just my job. It was my identity, my purpose, my way back from the darkness that had followed me home from war. "The review is a formality," Brenner continued. "I'll be recommending termination." Marcus stepped forward. "Then you'll need to fire me too." I supported the captain's decision completely. "And me," Elena added. Brenner's face reddened. "This isn't a democracy. Get out, all of you, and Jackson—" His voice dropped to a hiss. "I'll make sure you never fly air ambulance again. Not in this state, not anywhere." Outside, the hurricane raged on, indifferent to human drama. We stood in the hospital corridor, silence stretching between us. "I'm sorry," I finally said. You shouldn't have put your jobs on the line. Elena snorted. Don't flatter yourself, we did it for those patients. Marcus grinned. Besides, I've been wanting to tell Brenner off for years. Corporate medicine is killing people with its spreadsheets and protocols. I should have felt devastated. Instead, I felt oddly liberated. Drinks on me then. Once this hurricane blows over. What I didn't know then was that the storm outside was nothing compared to what awaited us in its aftermath. 3 days later, Hurricane Eliza had moved inland, weakening to a tropical depression that drenched the Carolinas. Tampa began the long process of assessing damage and rebuilding. I spent those days in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, fighting the creeping sense of purposelessness that had nearly consumed me after leaving the military. The knock on my door came just after noon on the 4th day. I expected Elena or Marcus, maybe with that promised drink. Instead, I found Sarah, the paramedic from Bayshore, flanked by a middle-aged couple. Captain Jackson? The man stepped forward, hand extended. I'm Robert Mercer. This is my wife, John. Our son, Tommy, was the boy with the broken arm. I shook his hand automatically, confused by their presence. We wanted to thank you personally, Jean said, eyes glistening. The doctor said if Tommy hadn't reached the trauma center when he did, she trailed off, unable to finish. Sarah filled the silence. They told us what happened, that you might lose your job because of us. It was my decision, I said simply. Robert's grip on my hand tightened. A decision that saved our son's life. So now we need to know, what can we do to help you? I invited them in more out of politeness than expectation. But as Sarah explained the situation in detail, Brenner's threats, the suspension, the likely termination, something remarkable happened. Robert Mercer's face set with determination. This isn't right, he declared. My brother's a reporter for the Tampa Tribune. The public should know what happened. The media won't care, I said bitterly. Man does job, gets fired for breaking rules. That's not news. Jean Mercer's gaze was steady. Hero veteran saves lives during hurricane, while corporate bureaucrats hide in offices. That's very much news, Captain Jackson. Within 24 hours, the story broke, not just in the Tampa Tribune but across local television. Robert's brother turned out to be an excellent storyteller, painting a vivid contrast between my combat-honed decision-making and corporate inflexibility. By the second day, national outlets had picked it up. By the third, Funkerfly Jacksonfly was trending on social media. Patients from that night came forward with testimonials. The parents of the ventilator-dependent patient created an online petition demanding my reinstatement. Veterans groups expressed outrage. Even politicians, sensing which way the wind blew, began making statements about American heroes and bureaucratic overreach. Medilift's corporate headquarters issued a tepid statement. We are reviewing the incident in question and remain committed to patient safety and regulatory compliance. The pressure mounted. Protesters gathered outside Tampa General with signs reading, "Protocols don't save lives, pilots do," and "Who would you want flying in a storm?" On the 7th day, my phone rang. It was Brenner. "This has gotten out of hand, Jackson," he said without preamble. "The board is concerned about the public relations impact. I imagine they are. They're offering reinstatement, full back pay, clean record. All you need to do is issue a joint statement acknowledging the importance of protocols while recognizing the extraordinary circumstances." I let the silence stretch, savoring the moment. Then, "No." "Excuse me?" I said no. "I don't want to come back." Brenner's confusion was audible. "Don't be stupid, Jackson. This is your career we're talking about." "Exactly. My career. My choice." I hung up. The media attention brought something unexpected. Opportunities. Job offers from private aviation companies. Speaking requests from medical conferences. A book deal. But none of it felt right. None of it addressed the fundamental problem. The gap between what emergency response systems needed and what they had. The revelation came during a late night conversation with Elena and Marcus at a bar near the hospital. They'd both quit Medilift in solidarity, though I'd begged them not to. The system's broken, Marcus was saying, nursing his third beer. It's all liability concerns and profit margins. Nobody's training people for the real stuff. The judgment calls, the impossible situations. Elena nodded. In nursing school, they drill protocols into you, but in the field you learn that sometimes protocols kill. There's no class for that. There should be, I said quietly. They both looked at me. There should be a class for that, a school. Somewhere that teaches not just the technical skills, but the judgment, the decision-making under pressure, the human factor. Elena leaned forward. Are you thinking what I think you're thinking? Maybe. Ideas were crystallizing, possibilities taking shape. We have the expertise, the experience, the real-world know-how that no textbook covers. Marcus grinned. Rescue Pilot Academy, Jackson School for Rule-Breaking Heroes? Something like that. I took a sip of my whiskey. But legitimate. Accredited. A place that fills the gap between what emergency responders are taught and what they actually need to know. We talked late into the night, possibilities expanding with each hour. By closing time, the outline of something revolutionary had taken shape. The next morning, I called Robert Mercer. Remember when you asked what you could do to help me? I have an answer now. Creating a training academy from scratch turned out to be even harder than flying through a hurricane. Accreditation requirements, insurance hurdles, curriculum development, finding a facility, securing a helicopter. Robert Mercer's connections proved invaluable. As a successful construction contractor, he knew people who knew people. Gian, we discovered, had been a university administrator before retiring to raise Tommy. She navigated the accreditation labyrinth with practiced ease. The Bayshore paramedics, Sarah and her colleagues, joined our effort, bringing their ground-based expertise to complement our air operations knowledge. Elena designed medical protocols that balanced safety with flexibility. Marcus developed simulation scenarios based on actual incidents where rigid adherence to protocol had led to negative outcomes. 6 months of exhausting work culminated in the Jackson Mercer Emergency Response Academy, a converted warehouse near the regional airport where we'd refueled during the hurricane. We had 1 helicopter, leased, not owned, 4 flight simulators, and a reputation that drew applications from across the country. Our first class consisted of 24 students, experienced paramedics, nurses, and pilots seeking to enhance their emergency response capabilities. On the first day, I stood before them more nervous than I'd ever been flying into combat. Standard training teaches you what to do, I began. We're going to teach you when not to do it. When to trust your judgment over your checklist. When saving lives means coloring outside the lines. From the back of the room, a voice called out, "Is that what you did during Hurricane Eliza?" I looked up to see a familiar face, the third Bayshore paramedic from that night, whose name I'd never caught in the chaos. "It's what we all did," I replied. Every person in that helicopter made the same choice, to see people, not protocols, to value lives over liabilities. He nodded, satisfaction evident. That's why I'm here. Our curriculum was unlike any other. Beyond the technical skills, which we taught rigorously, we emphasized ethical decision-making, crisis leadership, and what we called resilient improvisation. Students faced simulations designed to force impossible choices, to make them confront the gap between textbook solutions and messy reality. We brought in guest instructors, combat medics, wilderness rescue specialists, disaster response veterans, people who'd faced the worst and found ways through it. Word spread. Emergency services directors came to observe. Medical schools expressed interest in our methods. Even the military sent observers, curious about our approach to training judgment, alongside skill. One visitor, however, was unexpected. I was demonstrating auto-rotation techniques in the flight simulator when Elena appeared at the door, face tense. "Lawrence Brenner is here," she said quietly. "He's asking to speak with you." My stomach tightened. Despite our success, or perhaps because of it, Brenner had continued his campaign against me. He'd tried to challenge our accreditation, had spoken against our methods at industry conferences, had even warned hospitals against hiring our graduates. Where is he? Main conference room. Marcus is keeping him company. Her expression added silently, and making sure he doesn't sabotage anything. I found Brenner standing stiffly by the window watching as a group of students practiced patient loading drills with the helicopter. He'd lost weight since I'd last seen him, and his hair had more gray. "Director Brenner," I said from the doorway. "This is unexpected." He turned, his expression unreadable. "It's not director anymore, just Brenner will do." "You're not with MediLift?" A tight smile. "Let's just say your media circus had far-reaching consequences. The board decided they needed leadership more aligned with the company's public image." "I'm sorry to hear that. I wasn't sure if I meant it. Are you?" He gestured toward the training yard. "You've done well for yourself, building quite the operation here. We're meeting a need." Brenner nodded slowly. "Yes. That's why I'm here, actually." He seemed to struggle with his next words. "You were right. Of all the things I'd expected him to say, that wasn't on the list. About judgment trumping protocol sometimes, about the limitations of our training methods." He sighed heavily. "I've spent 20 years in emergency services, Jackson. Always by the book. Always careful. And watching what you did, what you risked, made me question all of it." I studied his face, looking for insincerity, for some hidden agenda. Found none. "What do you want, Brenner?" "A job." He straightened, his shoulders. "I've got 2 decades of administrative experience in emergency medical services. I know the regulations inside out, the politics, the funding mechanisms, things your operation could probably use. You want to work for me?" I couldn't keep the incredulity from my voice. "With you," he corrected. "Your academy is doing important work. Work that could save lives. Not just the patients your graduates will treat, but the responders themselves. Teaching them to make better decisions under pressure might keep them from burning out, from making mistakes born of rigidity." I thought of the desperate nights after returning from Afghanistan, the feeling of being adrift, purposeless. The way flying air ambulance had given me back a sense of mission. "Everyone deserves a second chance," I said finally. "A new mission." We shook hands, former adversaries, now tentative allies. As I showed him around the facility, introducing him to staff and students, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't experienced since the night of the hurricane. That evening, after the day's training had concluded, I climbed into our leased helicopter for a maintenance check flight. Alone in the cockpit, running through the familiar pre-flight sequence, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From war zones to hurricanes to classrooms. From following orders to breaking them to teaching others when to do either. From the brink of losing everything to creating something new. As the rotors spun up and the helicopter lifted from the pad, I felt that familiar sense of elevation, not just physical, but spiritual. The ground fell away, perspective widened, possibilities expanded. Up here you could see beyond immediate obstacles to broader horizons. That was what our academy really taught. Not just emergency response techniques, but a way of seeing, of recognizing when rules serve life and when they don't. Of understanding that true evacuation isn't just about moving people from danger to safety, but about lifting them from rigid thinking to something more adaptable, more human. The radio crackled. "Academy Ops to Jackson. How's she handling?" Smiled, banking the helicopter gently toward the setting sun. "Perfectly. All systems normal. Coming home." Home. After years of searching, I'd finally found it. Not in a place, but in a purpose. In the knowledge that what I was building mattered. That it would save lives long after my flying days were done. The helicopter responded to my touch. Sensitive, but strong, like a living thing. Below, the academy's lights blinked on against the gathering dusk, a beacon guiding me back. I'd evacuated many people in my career, from battlefields, from disasters, from medical emergencies. But perhaps the most important evacuation had been my own, from the prison of protocols that valued systems over souls, from the indifference that placed policy above people. Some evacuations aren't measured in miles, but in mindsets. Some rescue missions save the rescuer as much as the rescued. As I brought the helicopter in for landing, students gathered to watch, faces upturned in the wash of the rotors. Tomorrow's rescuers, learning not just how to fly, but when to break the rules that bind us to the ground. I set the bird down with feather-light precision, shut down the engines, and stepped out into my new life, the one I'd risked everything to create, the one that finally felt like coming home. Instead, he would tell her about the beauty of Mexico, the kindness of its people, the richness of its culture. He would build for her the same illusion he had tried to create for himself, that the world was fundamentally good, that peace was possible, that even men of violence could choose a different path. As his plane lifted off from Puerto Vallarta International Airport, Frank gazed down at the coastline falling away beneath him. Somewhere in that sprawling city, 5 men were telling their friends about their encounter with an American grandfather who commanded helicopter gunships and elite soldiers. The story would grow with each telling, becoming legend. Frank smiled at the thought. Perhaps that was legacy enough for an old warrior, not the classified missions or the lives taken in service to country, but the final act of mercy, when vengeance had been within his grasp. His phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Location secure, mission complete. Take care, Dad." Frank typed back, "Love you, son, thank you." Then he turned off his phone and closed his eyes, allowing himself to drift into sleep as the aircraft carried him toward new horizons. In his dreams, there were no wars, no missions, no violence, only the peace he had spent a lifetime fighting for but never truly found. Until now, perhaps. Until now. 3 months later, at a rundown bar on the outskirts of Puerto Vallarta, a tourist was being harassed by local troublemakers. The bartender, noticing the situation escalating, leaned across the counter toward the group. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he warned, his voice low but clear. The leader of the group laughed. "Why not? He's just another rich American." The bartender glanced meaningfully at the ceiling, where the distant sound of helicopter rotors could be heard passing overhead. A routine border patrol, nothing more. "The last old American who was bothered in this town," the bartender said, "turned out to have friends. Very powerful friends who came from the sky." The troublemakers exchanged looks, their bravado faltering. The bearded one among them unconsciously rubbed his wrists, as if feeling phantom restraints. "Let's go somewhere else," he muttered, backing away from the tourist who remained blissfully unaware of what had nearly happened, or of the legend that had saved him. Outside, the night sky was clear, the stars brilliant above the Mexican coastline. Somewhere across that same sky, Frank Dawson sat on a terrace in Santorini, watching a similar array of stars and thinking about the nature of peace and the long shadows cast by a lifetime of violence. He would never know about the tourist who had been spared because of him, just as the tourist would never know about the old warrior whose legacy had protected him. But perhaps that was the point of it all. The connections we never see, the ripples we create without knowing, the ways in which mercy can echo long after vengeance has faded. Frank raised his glass to the night sky in a silent toast. To retirement, yes. But also to something he had never expected to find after so many years of war. The possibility of redemption. The convenience store owner stared wide-eyed through the window. "Federales?" she asked, her voice hushed. Frank shook his head. "SWAT," he corrected her. "My son's unit." The first vehicle stopped outside the store and Michael emerged, dressed in full tactical gear, his face a mask of controlled fury. Behind him, 16 operators deployed, weapons ready, communications equipment linking them to the helicopters overhead. When Michael saw his father, bloodied, bruised, his clothes torn, something dangerous flashed across his face. He'd seen Frank injured before, had grown up with a father who sometimes returned from business trips with unexplained wounds, but never like this. Never as an old man victimized by common thugs. Description? Michael asked, his voice clipped. Frank gave him details: the snake tattoo, the bearded leader, the motorcycles. Michael relayed this information to his team, then turned back to his father. "We're running a cartel interdiction exercise 10 miles from here," he explained, though Frank hadn't asked. "Official jurisdiction. Full tactical authority." Frank understood what his son wasn't saying. Michael's unit had legal clearance to operate in Mexican territory. What they were about to do would be covered by that operational mandate, regardless of whether it had anything to do with cartels. "We'll find them," Michael promised. Frank nodded, suddenly feeling every one of his 82 years. "I know you, Will." What followed was a demonstration of American military efficiency that would have made Frank's old unit proud. Surveillance footage from city cameras was accessed. Local informants were questioned. The helicopters swept the city, their thermal imaging systems identifying motorcycle heat signatures. It took 35 minutes to locate them, gathered at a rundown bar on the outskirts of town, celebrating their successful hunt with cheap tequila and cheaper women. Michael insisted Frank remain in the lead vehicle as they approached the location. "You should see this," was all he said. The bar's patrons scattered as the helicopters hovered overhead, spotlights illuminating the dusty parking lot where 5 motorcycles stood in a haphazard line. The SWAT team deployed with military precision, surrounding the building, securing exits, establishing a perimeter that not even a ghost could have slipped through. Michael spoke into his radio, his voice echoing through loudspeakers mounted on the vehicles. "This is a U.S. law enforcement operation in conjunction with Mexican authorities. We are searching for individuals connected to cartel activities. Everyone inside the building come out with your hands visible." People began to emerge: waitstaff, customers, a few women in revealing clothes. They were directed to a holding area, identified and released if they weren't among the targets. And then they appeared. The 5 men who had beaten Frank hours earlier, their arrogance replaced by confusion and fear as they faced the overwhelming force arrayed against them. "Those are them," Frank confirmed, watching through the vehicle's window. What happened next occurred with such speed and precision that he almost missed it. On some silent signal from Michael, his operators moved. The 5 men were separated, isolated and subdued before they could offer any resistance. Zip-tied and hooded, they were loaded into separate vehicles. Michael returned to where his father waited. "We've got them," he said. "They'll be processed through the system properly." Frank studied his son's face, so much like his own had been decades ago, and knew he was lying. "What system?" he asked quietly. A muscle twitched in Michael's jaw. "The one that ensures justice is served." He helped Frank from the vehicle, leading him to where the bearded leader of the group knelt on the ground, hands bound behind him, hood covering his face. With a quick motion, Michael removed the hood, revealing the man's wide, frightened eyes. Recognition dawned as he looked up at Frank. "You?" he whispered in disbelief. Frank stared down at him. This man who had thought him weak, who had taken pleasure in hurting someone he perceived as defenseless. Behind Frank stood his son and 16 elite operators, helicopters circling overhead, the full might of American military precision focused on 5 small-time criminals who had chosen the wrong victim. "My father has something to say to you," Michael announced, his voice carrying to his team. The parking lot fell silent. Even the helicopters seemed to hover more quietly, as if waiting for Frank's words. Frank knelt down, ignoring the pain in his ribs, until he was eye level with the man who had beaten him. "I want you to understand something," he said, his voice steady. "I've killed more men than you've ever met. I've toppled governments and prevented wars. I am not just an old American tourist. I am what stands between civilization and chaos." Fear turned the man's face pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. "But today," Frank continued, "I'm going to show you mercy. Not because you deserve it, but because I've seen enough blood in my lifetime." He stood, turning to Michael. "Take what they stole from me and let them go." Surprise flickered across Michael's face, followed by understanding. He nodded to his team, who proceeded to search the 5 men, recovering Frank's wallet, phone, and watch. The souvenir, his granddaughter's gift, was gone, lost in the gutter where it had been tossed. "Release them," Michael ordered. As the zip ties were cut, Frank watched the confusion on the faces of their captives. They had expected torture, perhaps death. Instead, they were being set free. The bearded leader rubbed his wrists, eyeing Frank warily. "Why?" he asked. "Because now you'll live with the knowledge that your life was in my hands," Frank answered. "And if you ever touch another tourist, another human being, I'll know. And next time, I won't be so forgiving." They left them, there standing in the dust as the convoy departed. In the helicopter flying back to Frank's hotel, Michael sat beside his father, studying his face. "You surprised me," Michael admitted. "I thought you'd want them punished." Frank looked out at the city lights below them, thinking of all the violence he'd seen and caused throughout his long life. "There's been enough punishment," he said finally. "Maybe it's time for something else." But as they flew through the night sky, Frank couldn't help but wonder if he'd made the right choice. Peace had always been more difficult for him than war, forgiveness harder than vengeance. Perhaps true retirement wasn't about leaving the battlefield, but about choosing which battles were worth fighting. When they landed at a private airstrip near Frank's hotel, Michael insisted on having his medic examine his father's injuries. 2 cracked ribs, multiple contusions, a mild concussion. Painful but not life-threatening for a man who had survived far worse. "You could press charges," Michael suggested as the medic wrapped Frank's ribs. "We have them on surveillance assaulting you. It would be an open and shut case." Frank shook his head. "No, it's over." Michael didn't argue, but Frank could see the frustration in his eyes. The son wanting justice for his father. The soldier wanting punishment for those who had violated his code. "I'm proud of you," Frank told him, reaching out to grip his arm. "Not for tonight, but for the man you've become. Your mother would be proud too." At the mention of his mother, Frank's first wife, lost to cancer 20 years ago, Michael's expression softened. "She always said you were the strongest man she knew, not because of what you could do, but because of what you chose not to do." They parted at the hotel, Michael's team disappearing into the night as quietly as they had arrived. Frank watched, the helicopters fade into the distance, carrying with them the last echoes of the violence that had defined so much of his life. In his room, Frank stood at the window overlooking the ocean, the same view he had admired with a tequila toast just hours earlier. Everything looked identical, yet nothing was the same. In the space of one evening, he had been reminded of both his fragility and his power. An old man vulnerable to physical attack, yet connected to forces that could descend from the sky at his word. He thought of the 5 men they had captured and released. Would they learn from this encounter? Would they change? Or would they simply find easier targets, ones without sons commanding elite tactical units? As dawn broke over Puerto Vallarta, Frank made a decision. His vacation would continue, but not here. There were other places to see, other experiences to have in whatever time remained to him. The world was vast, and he had spent too much of his life in its shadows. He booked a flight to Barcelona, a city he had once visited on an operation but never truly seen. From there, perhaps Greece or Morocco. Places where history stretched, back thousands of years, reminding even old men like him that their time is but a blink in the great span of human existence. Before leaving his hotel, Frank purchased another souvenir for his granddaughter, this one a delicate silver bracelet, inlaid with turquoise, far more elegant than the painted figurine that had been destroyed. He had it shipped directly to her home in Virginia, with a note promising to tell her the story behind it someday. Not the true story, of course. She was only 12, too young to understand the darkness that had lived inside her grandfather all these years. Too innocent to comprehend how close those 5 men had come to death at the hands of American special forces because they had chosen the wrong elderly tourist to rob. The sound of a neck breaking has always reminded observers of a thick branch snapping during winter frost. Clean, definitive, final. Frank Dawson hadn't heard that sound in nearly 30 years, not since his last mission in Kashmir. Yet here, he was, an 82-year-old man with arthritis in both knees, listening to that unmistakable crack. Before we begin, put the word justice in the comments, if you believe in justice. 3 weeks earlier, Frank was navigating the crowded streets of New Delhi, sweat dampening his collar despite the lightweight linen shirt he'd purchased specifically for this trip. The air hung heavy with spices, exhaust fumes, and the persistent buzz of millions of lives intersecting in organized chaos. "You're sure about this intel, Frank?" The voice in his earpiece belonged to Director Shapiro, a man half his age who'd never seen combat but somehow found himself in charge of veteran operatives like Frank. "Positive," Frank muttered, keeping his voice low as he moved through the market. "Pakistan's moving something across the border tonight. Not troops. Something worse. He had been pulled out of semi-retirement for this mission. His extensive experience in the India-Pakistan conflict made him the only viable candidate for a delicate reconnaissance operation. The official stance was that tensions between the nuclear powers were de-escalating, but intelligence suggested otherwise. "We need confirmation, not speculation." Shapiro's voice crackled. "The Pentagon doesn't want another false alarm." Frank ignored him, focusing instead on the man he'd been following for the past 20 minutes. Amir Khatri, mid-level intelligence officer for Pakistan's ISI, was meeting someone he shouldn't be meeting in a part of Delhi where he had no business being. As darkness fell, Frank tracked Khatri to an abandoned warehouse near the Yamuna River. The smell of sewage and industrial waste hung in the air as he positioned himself on a neighboring rooftop, night vision binoculars trained on the building's entrance. What he witnessed that night would be his final contribution to American intelligence. 3 unmarked trucks, 6 men with radiation detection equipment, and a single lead-lined container the size of a refrigerator. "Are you seeing this?" Frank whispered into his comm. "Jesus Christ." Shapiro's voice had lost its bureaucratic edge. "That's a portable nuclear component." Within hours, the information had reached the highest levels of government. Within days, a covert diplomatic intervention had prevented what could have been the first nuclear confrontation since the Cold War. And within weeks, Frank was officially done, retired after 60 years of service to a country that would never know what he'd done for it. His government pension was substantial, his health surprisingly good for a man who'd been shot 4 times and stabbed twice over the course of his career. Frank decided it was finally time to see something of the world without having to kill anyone in it, which is how he found himself in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, enjoying the sunset from his oceanfront hotel room with a glass of good tequila in hand. 2. Retirement. He toasted the empty room, watching as the golden sun melted into the Pacific. The warmth of the liquor spread through his chest, easing the dull ache that had taken up permanent residence there. His son Michael had called earlier, that day. He was running tactical exercises with his SWAT unit somewhere along the border, training for cartel interdiction operations. "You sure you're okay down there alone, Dad?" he'd asked, the concern in his voice making him sound like the parent rather than the child. "I've survived 3 wars and 2 marriages," Frank reminded him. "I think I can handle a Mexican vacation." Michael had laughed, but the worry remained. "Just keep your phone on you. If you need anything." "I won't," Frank had interrupted, "but I appreciate it." After finishing his drink, he decided to take a walk into town. The evening air was warm, carrying the scent of salt and grilled seafood. Tourists and locals mingled in the streets, the atmosphere festive and light. For the first time in decades, Frank allowed himself to relax, to simply exist without scanning for threats or planning exits. That was his first mistake. He spotted a small souvenir shop, tucked between larger establishments, its windows displaying colorful Day of the Dead figurines and hand-painted tiles. His granddaughter's birthday was approaching, and he thought a genuine Mexican keepsake might please her more than the mass-produced airport gift shop options. As Frank exited the shop 30 minutes later, small package tucked under his arm, he noticed them. 5 men on motorcycles watching him with the predatory focus he recognized from decades of dealing with humanity's darker elements. They weren't cartel, too disorganized, too obvious. local. Troublemakers, perhaps, or opportunistic criminals looking for an easy target. And in him they saw exactly that, an elderly American tourist, alone and vulnerable. Frank assessed his options. His hotel was 4 blocks away. His sidearm was locked in the room safe, Mexican gun laws being what they were. His body, while still strong for his age, no longer moved with the speed or power it once had. He began walking, maintaining a steady pace, hoping they might choose an easier mark. But the rumble of engines behind him confirmed what he already knew. He'd been selected. The first motorcycle pulled alongside him, its rider a young man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck. "Hola, abuelo," he said, his tone mockingly respectful. "You look lost." "I'm fine, thank you," Frank replied, continuing to walk. A second bike blocked his path, forcing him to stop. The rider, heavier than the first, dismounted and approached him. "Americans always carry cash," he said in accented English. "Very dangerous in this neighborhood. You should let us escort you back to your hotel." Frank straightened his posture, meeting the man's gaze directly. "I was killing men before you were born," he said quietly. "Walk away now." They laughed, all 5 of them, the sound echoing off the buildings of the now deserted street. Frank had made his second mistake, revealing his pride instead of playing the frightened tourist. What followed was quick and humiliating. A blow to the back of Frank's knees sent him to the ground. Hands rifled through his pockets, taking his wallet, watch, and phone. Someone yanked the package from his grasp, tearing the wrapping. "Just a stupid doll," one of them spat, tossing his granddaughter's gift into the gutter. The largest one, a bearded man with arms covered in crude tattoos, grabbed Frank by his shirt collar, pulling him up to face him. "Maybe we should teach this old American a lesson," he said, his breath hot against Frank's face. "Show him some Mexican hospitality." Punch caught Frank in the stomach, driving the air from his lungs. As he doubled over, a second blow struck his ribs. He felt something crack, white-hot pain blooming across his side. They took turns, these young men, beating an 82-year-old veteran who had once been feared by enemies of state. With each blow, each kick, each mocking laugh, something inside Frank shifted. Not just bones, but something fundamental. The careful control he'd maintained for decades began to fracture. When they finally tired of their game, the bearded one spat on Frank as he lay on the pavement. "Welcome to Mexico, grandfather," he sneered. The sound of their motorcycles faded as they rode away, leaving Frank bleeding and broken on the street. He didn't know how long he lay there before finding the strength to stand. Pain radiated through his body as he limped toward the nearest open business, a small convenience store with flickering fluorescent lights. The young woman behind the counter gasped when Frank entered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Senor, you need a hospital." "I will call an ambulance." "No ambulance," Frank said, his voice a rasp. "Just a phone." She hesitated, then handed him her cell phone. With trembling fingers, he dialed the number Michael had made him memorize. Not his personal line, but a direct connection to his tactical unit. When Michael answered, his voice was professional, detached. "Operative Dawson." "It's Dad," Frank said, the words catching in his throat. "I need help." There was a moment of silence. Then, in a voice Frank hadn't heard since Michael was a small boy frightened by nightmares. "What happened?" Frank told him, not everything, but enough. Location. Description of the attackers. Their motorcycles. As he spoke, he could hear Michael issuing orders, his voice shifting from concerned son to commanding officer. 25 minutes, Michael said finally. "Find somewhere safe and wait. Can you do that?" Frank thought of the men who had beaten him, who had taken his dignity along with his possessions, men who thought they could assault a U.S. veteran with impunity. "Yes," he answered. "I can do that." The convenience store owner insisted Frank sit, brought him water, dabbed at the blood on his face with a clean cloth. He thanked her absently, his mind already shifting to what would happen next. Because he knew his son. He knew what Michael commanded, and he knew what was coming for the men who had attacked him. Exactly 23 minutes after his call, the first helicopter appeared. Over the city, its searchlight cutting through the night. The sound of its rotors drowned out the music from nearby bars and restaurants. A second helicopter followed, and then came the vehicles, black SUVs with government plates, moving with precision through streets suddenly vacant of pedestrians. Blood and mud caked Thomas Murray's knuckles as he pounded frantically on the departing train's metal exterior, his desperate screams drowned by the locomotive's thunderous roar. The transport to Normandy accelerated beyond his reach, leaving him collapsed on the rain-soaked platform. A lone figure watching his duty, his purpose, his brothers in arms all vanish into the misty English countryside. "No! Stop the goddamn train!" Thomas shouted uselessly, his voice breaking as the last car disappeared around the bend. He slumped to his knees, ignoring the stares of civilians and the few remaining military personnel. His army-issued duffel bag lay beside him, waterlogged and pathetic, much like its owner. At 22, Private Thomas Murray of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, had just become something worse than a civilian or a rookie. He was a soldier who had failed to follow orders. The train carrying reinforcements to the newly established beachhead in Normandy had departed on schedule at 600 hours. Without him, a passing MP eyed him suspiciously. "Problem, soldier?" Thomas straightened, hastily wiping mud from his uniform. "No, sir. Yes, sir. I was supposed to be on that transport." The MP's expression darkened. "Name and unit?" "Private Thomas Murray, 29th Infantry Division, sir." The officer scribbled in his notebook. "Report to Major Wilson's office immediately." Building C. Thomas gathered his belongings, his stomach churning with dread. 3 weeks after D-Day, every available man was being rushed to reinforce the fragile foothold in occupied France. Missing deployment wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially a court-martial offense. The irony wasn't lost on him. After months of training, after begging to be sent to the front instead of remaining with the replacement depot, he had finally received his orders. Then, in a moment of pure stupidity, he'd lost his combat boots in the deep mud while rushing to the station. 20 precious minutes spent retrieving them, and now his war might be over before it began. Major Wilson was a short, stocky man with a perpetual scowl that deepened when Thomas entered his makeshift office in the Railway Administration building. "Private Murray," he said without looking up from his paperwork. "You missed your transport." "Yes, sir. I apologize, sir. There was an incident with—" The major raised a hand, silencing him. "Spare me. Do you understand the gravity of your situation, son? Men are dying on those beaches while you're here making excuses about being late." Thomas stood at rigid attention, eyes fixed on the wall behind the officer. "No excuse, sir." "Damn right, no excuse." Major Wilson finally looked up, his bloodshot eyes betraying exhaustion that seemed to go beyond physical fatigue. "I've got half a mind to have you brought up on charges." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. Every letter from his father had emphasized the same thing. Don't disgrace the family name. 3 generations of Murrays had served honorably in American wars. Now he would be the first to fail. The major studied him for an uncomfortable moment. "Your commanding officer radioed ahead that you were one of his best marksmen." "I hunt, sir." "Back home. And now what? You expect me to find you another ride to the party?" Wilson shuffled through papers. "Next transport isn't until Thursday." Thursday. 3 more days of safety while others fought and died. The shame was suffocating. "Sir, if there's any way I could get there sooner." "There isn't. Report to Lieutenant Hayes for temporary assignment." Dismissed. The temporary barracks were nearly empty, most of its previous occupants now crossing the English Channel or already engaged in combat. Thomas sat alone on his bunk, composing a letter to his parents that he couldn't bring himself to finish. How could he explain his failure? His father, a great war veteran with a Purple Heart, would never understand. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of drowning in mud while invisible trains roared past. He woke before dawn, his sheets soaked with sweat despite the cool June air. The mess hall was quiet, populated mainly by administrative personnel and a few other stranded souls. Thomas prodded at rubbery powdered eggs when shouts erupted from the communication room next door. Officers rushed in and out, their faces grim, Rumors spread across the tables like wildfire. An hour later, they received the news. Lieutenant Hayes assembled the handful of waiting replacements in the courtyard. His face was ashen. At approximately 0200 hours, German bombers intercepted the troop transport train headed for Portsmouth. Direct hits were recorded on multiple cars. He paused, swallowing hard. Preliminary reports indicate over 70% casualties. The wounded are being transported to London hospitals. The rest? The world seemed to tilt beneath Thomas's feet. 70%. Men he'd trained with for months, faces and names and hometowns, jokes shared over cigarettes. All gone. Those of you scheduled for Thursday's transport will depart, as planned. Dismissed. Thomas remained rooted to the spot as others dispersed, murmuring in shocked tones. Lieutenant Hayes noticed him lingering. Something to say, Private? Sir, I was supposed to be on that train. The lieutenant's expression softened slightly. Then consider yourself fortunate, Murray. Get some rest. You'll need it. Fortune. Was that what this was? Thomas wandered the grounds aimlessly, his mind replaying every second of yesterday morning. If he'd been more careful with his boots, if he'd run faster, if he'd simply left them behind and deployed without them, would he now be among the dead? Or would he have somehow survived while others perished? That night, he knelt beside his bunk and prayed for the first time since childhood, not in gratitude for his salvation, but in confused supplication for those lost. Why them and not him? What cosmic mathematics determined who lived and who died? The nightmares changed. Now he was on the train as bombs fell, trapped in a metal coffin as flames consumed everything. He would wake gasping, only to find his tears had soaked the pillow. Thursday arrived with leaden skies. The new transport was heavily guarded, anti-aircraft, guns visible at strategic positions along the route. Nobody spoke much during the journey. Every soldier seemed lost in private thoughts, perhaps wondering if their train would be next. The English Channel crossing was mercifully uneventful, though. Thomas spent most of it vomiting over the sight of the landing craft. By the time they reached the Normandy coast, what remained of his breakfast was gone, leaving only bitter bile and the acrid taste of fear. The beaches looked nothing like the newsreels. No heroic charges, no dramatic music. Just mud, equipment, and the efficient machinery of war logistics. The scent of death lingered beneath the stronger smells of diesel and seawater. Thomas wondered how many bodies lay beneath the sand they walked across. His new unit was positioned near St. Lo, where American forces were preparing for a major offensive. Captain Reynolds, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, greeted the replacements with minimal enthusiasm. You'll learn on the job, he told them. Stay close to the experienced men, do exactly what they tell you, that's how you stay alive. His gaze lingered on Thomas. Murray, right? You're the one who missed the train. Word traveled fast in the army. Yes, sir. Report to Sergeant Donovan. We need another scout. Donovan was tall and rail-thin with a 1,000-yard stare that seemed to look through Thomas rather than at him. You any good in the woods, Pennsylvania? Yes, Sergeant. Hunted all my life. This ain't deer season. Donovan handed him a modified M1 Garand with a scope. But the principle's the same. Stay quiet, move slow, shoot straight. We go out at dusk. That evening, Thomas followed Donovan and 2 other scouts through hedgerows so dense they seemed designed specifically to hide enemy soldiers. Every shadow concealed potential death. Every sound, bird, breeze, or falling leaf sent his heart. Racing 2 hours into their patrol, they encountered their first Germans, a 3-man machine gun team setting up a position to cover the road. Donovan signaled with hand gestures. Thomas understood immediately. He would take the gunner. The others would handle the remaining 2. His target was a boy who looked no older than 18, with white blonde hair visible beneath his helmet. Thomas lined up the shot, finger resting lightly on the trigger. The crosshairs settled on the German's chest. One gentle squeeze and the boy would cease to exist. Some mother back in Hamburg or Munich would receive a telegram. not unlike those being delivered across America to the families of men who had been on that train. The radio crackled softly. Donovan whispered urgently, "Take the shot, Murray." Thomas fired. The German fell. 2 more shots from his companions and the encounter was over. Later, back at camp, Donovan clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work out there, clean shot." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. He'd killed his first man with clinical precision, a perfect heart shot, just like hunting whitetail back home. Only this time his prey had a mother, perhaps a sweetheart, certainly. Dreams that would never be realized. That night he wrote in his journal, "I lived because others died on that train, and now others die because I live. Where is the sense in any of it?" The summer of 1944 unfolded in a series of offensives, counterattacks, and bloody stalemates. Thomas distinguished himself as a scout and marksman, earning a reputation for returning, with valuable intelligence and precise kill counts. The raw recruit who had missed his train was forgotten. In his place stood a hardened soldier whom others trusted with their lives. July bleeded into August, and the Allied advance continued. Thomas's unit pushed through town after town, farm after farm. Some days brought fierce resistance, others passed in eerie quiet. The hedgerow country was perfect for ambushes, on both sides. During one reconnaissance mission, they stumbled upon a German patrol. The ensuing firefight left 2 Americans dead, and Corporal Jenkins badly wounded. A bullet lodged dangerously close to his spine. "Can't move him," the medic said grimly. "Need a proper evacuation." "Germans between us and base," Donovan replied. "No way to call it in." Thomas studied their map. "There's a route here through this ravine. Narrow, but if I go alone, I can make it back and bring help." Donovan considered this. Too risky. More risky than leaving Jenkins to die? Or all of us trying to carry him through enemy territory? After a moment's hesitation, Donovan nodded. "Go. Fast and quiet." Thomas traveled through the night, navigating by stars and instinct. Twice he froze as German patrols passed within yards of his position. By dawn, he reached American lines and guided a medical team back to his stranded unit. Jenkins survived. Thomas received a Bronze Star. "Why'd you do it?" Jenkins asked him later in the field hospital. "Could have gotten yourself killed." Thomas had no simple answer. Just seemed like the right thing. But privately he wondered, was he trying to balance some cosmic ledger? One life saved for each who had died on that train in his place? As autumn approached, Thomas received word that his childhood friend Michael Delaney had been killed in the Pacific. They'd grown up on the same street in Pittsburgh, enlisted together after Pearl Harbor. Thomas hadn't seen him since basic training, when they'd been assigned to different theaters. The letter from Michael's sister described how he'd died saving 2 wounded Marines on Guam. "He always admired your bravery," she wrote, unaware that Thomas's most consequential act had been losing his boots in the mud. That night, he wandered to the edge of camp and stared up at the stars, the same stars that shone over Guam, over Pittsburgh, over the graves of soldiers scattered across 2 hemispheres. Why had fate spared him that June morning only to take Michael? What purpose could possibly justify such random cruelty? Contemplating the universe, Murray. Captain Reynolds appeared beside him, offering a cigarette. Thomas accepted it with a nod. "Just thinking about home, sir." "Liar." Reynolds lit his own cigarette. "You're thinking about that train?" Thomas stiffened. "Sir?" "Word gets around. Some of the men think you've got a guardian angel." Reynolds exhaled a plume of smoke. "Others think you're living on borrowed time. And you, sir?" "I think you're a good soldier asking bad questions." Reynolds gazed upward. "Why me? Why them? There's no answer that satisfies, Murray. Trust me, I've looked." They smoked in silence for a while. "My father was at Belleau Wood," Reynolds finally said. "Whole platoon wiped out except for him and one other man. Spent the rest of his life wondering why he made it home when better men didn't. Did he ever figure it out? No, but he used the life he got. Became a doctor. saved more lives than were lost that day. Reynolds dropped his cigarette, crushing it underfoot. That's all any of us can do. Use the time we're given. The autumn campaign brought Thomas's unit to the German border. The enemy fought with increasing desperation, and casualties mounted on both sides. Thomas now led his own reconnaissance squad, his initial failure long forgotten beneath accumulated commendations and respect. In November, during the push toward the Siegfried Line, they encountered heavy resistance near a small village. Thomas's squad was tasked with locating enemy artillery positions that had been decimating American armor. They found the German 88s entrenched on a wooded hillside, well camouflaged and protected by infantry. As they withdrew to report the coordinates, machine gun fire erupted from their flank. Private Wilson went down immediately, a bullet through his throat. "Fall back," Thomas ordered, laying covering fire as his men retreated. He was preparing to follow when he spotted movement. Wilson was still alive, hand reaching weakly toward them. Without thinking, Thomas rushed forward, dragging the wounded man behind a fallen tree as bullets splintered the wood around them. Wilson's eyes were wide with panic, blood bubbling from his mouth. Thomas applied pressure to the wound, knowing it was futile. "Hold on, medic's coming." The lie came easily. They both knew no medic would reach them here. Wilson clutched Thomas's wrist with surprising strength. He tried to speak, blood garbling his words. "Save your strength," Thomas urged. Wilson shook his head frantically, pulling Thomas closer. With supreme effort, he whispered, "Not your fault." Then he was gone, eyes fixed on some distant point, beyond the battle, beyond Germany, perhaps beyond life itself. Thomas remained frozen, Wilson's last words echoing in his mind. Not your fault. Had Wilson somehow known about the train, about Thomas's private guilt, or was he simply absolving Thomas of responsibility for his death here now in this anonymous stretch of forest? German fire intensified. Thomas knew he should move, but found himself unable to leave Wilson's body. Death had seemed abstract when delivered through a rifle scope from hundreds of yards away. Here it was intimate, meticulous in its detail. The precise pattern of blood splatter, the slight part of lips, the emptiness behind eyes that moments before had contained a universe of thought and feeling. A mortar shell exploded nearby, the concussion finally jolting him into motion. Thomas crawled through underbrush, evading German patrols until he rejoined his unit hours later. That night, he sat alone in the camp chapel, a repurposed barn with a makeshift cross fashioned from artillery shell casings. No chaplain was present. Thomas was grateful for the solitude. "I don't understand," he whispered to the empty space. "Any of it." The only answer was distant artillery fire, a dull percussion that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Winter descended with brutal force. The advancing Allied armies slowed as supply lines stretched thin, and German resistance stiffened. Thomas's unit found itself holding a section of forest near the Belgian border when the massive German counteroffensive began on December 16th. What would later be called the Battle of the Bulge erupted around them. Cut off from the main American forces, Thomas and 30 other men dug in amid the snow-covered pines, determined to hold their position until reinforcements arrived. Days passed. Ammunition ran low. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Men died from German bullets, artillery, or simply the merciless cold. Thomas moved constantly between positions, encouraging, strategizing, sharing meager rations. On Christmas Eve, German loudspeakers broadcast across no man's land. "American soldiers, you are surrounded. Surrender now and receive medical treatment. And hot food. Continue fighting and face certain death." The remaining men looked to Thomas, who had assumed command after Lieutenant Parker's death 2 days earlier. "What do we do, Murray?" asked Corporal Hayes, barely 19 and shivering uncontrollably. Thomas checked their inventory. 12 men still capable of fighting, ammunition for perhaps one more skirmish, food for another day if carefully rationed. "We hold," he said simply. That night the Germans attacked in force. Thomas organized his men in a tight defensive perimeter, making each bullet count. When ammunition ran out, they fought with bayonets, entrenching tools, bare hands. Thomas Took a bullet through his left shoulder but continued fighting, his blood steaming in the bitter cold. Dawn revealed a scene of carnage. 6 Americans remained alive, surrounded by German dead. Against all odds they had held. By mid-morning, the distant rumble of tanks announced the arrival of Patton's Third Army. The siege was broken. As medics tended his wound, Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of the past month swirling through his mind, the mud, the missed train, the faces of men he'd fought beside and buried. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to England, and finally home to recover. The war in Europe ended while he convalesced in a Pennsylvania hospital. He watched from his wheelchair as Pittsburgh erupted in celebration, confetti raining down on jubilant crowds. A nurse wheeled him back to his room. "Not joining the party, Lieutenant Murray?" He shook his head. "Doesn't feel finished to me. Japan surrendered in August after the atomic bombs." Thomas was discharged with a Silver Star, a Purple Heart, and a body that would never again function quite as it had before the war. The shoulder wound had caused nerve damage. His left arm remained partially numb, with limited range of motion. Returning to civilian life proved harder than combat in some ways. Thomas enrolled in college on the GI Bill, studying mechanical engineering. He dated occasionally but found it difficult to connect with women who had experienced the war only through newsreels and rationing. One exception was Eleanor Hayes, a former Army nurse who had served in field hospitals across Europe. On their third date, she noticed him massaging his damaged shoulder. "Belgium?" she asked. "How did you know?" "I treated hundreds like you. Something about the way you favor it." She gently moved his hand aside, her fingers finding the knots of scar tissue. "May I?" Her touch was professional yet intimate. Thomas felt the familiar pain ease slightly. "You're good at that. Had plenty of practice." Her eyes held shadows similar to those he saw in his own mirror. "Patton's push to Bastogne?" "Yes." "You were there too?" "Evacuation hospital in Luxembourg. December was busy. They married 6 months later." Neither needed to explain the nightmares, the sudden silences, the occasional 1,000-yard stares. They simply understood. Thomas graduated and took a position with Westinghouse designing industrial equipment. They bought a small house in the suburbs, had 2 children, Michael, named for his lost friend, and Catherine for Eleanor's grandmother. Life assumed a predictable rhythm, yet Thomas never fully escaped the shadow of that June morning in 1944. Each anniversary of D-Day brought the familiar questions back. Why had he survived when others hadn't? What purpose had been served? Eleanor found him one night in their backyard, staring at the stars after a particularly vivid nightmare. "The train again?" she asked, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders. He nodded. "I keep seeing their faces, men I never even met." "You can't carry them forever, Tom. Someone has to remember. Remembering is different from drowning." She turned his face toward hers. "You've built a good life. Our children need their father present, not lost in 1944. He knew she was right. Gradually, Thomas learned to contain his war memories, not eliminating them but placing them in perspective. He coached Little League, attended PTA meetings, built a workshop in the garage where he created intricate wooden toys for his children. Decades passed. His children grew, attended college, started families of their own. Thomas retired, dedicating more time to woodworking and his growing collection of grandchildren. The war receded further into history, discussed mainly on Memorial Day or when he occasionally met another veteran. In May 2001, his eldest grandson Ryan graduated from high school. During the family celebration, the 17-year-old pulled Thomas aside. "Grandpa, I need to talk to you." They walked to a quiet corner of the backyard. "What's on your mind, son?" Ryan straightened his shoulders. "I've decided to enlist. After what happened in September, I feel like I need to do something." The September 11 attacks had shocked the nation 8 months earlier. War in Afghanistan had followed, with talk of further military action elsewhere. Thomas studied his grandson's face, so young, so earnest, so reminiscent of faces from long ago. "Your parents know?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, since you were in a war. Thomas sat heavily on a garden bench. Why me? Because you never talk about it. Dad says you came back a hero, but you never tell the stories other vets do. Ryan sat beside him. I want to know what it was really like. For a moment, Thomas was silent, considering how to respond. Finally, he said, "Walk with me." They strolled to the front of the house where Thomas's restored 1939 Ford was parked. Get in. They drove in silence through suburban streets, eventually reaching a small military cemetery on the outskirts of town. Thomas parked and led Ryan to a modest granite memorial listing local men who had died in various conflicts. He pointed to a section labeled 1941-1945. I knew 7 of these men personally, grew up with some of them. His finger traced familiar names. Michael Delaney, Pacific Theater. Robert Jenkins, died in Holland. William Parker, Belgium. Ryan remained respectfully silent. But there are other names that should be here. Men from a train I was supposed to be on. Thomas took a deep breath. Did your father ever tell you why I walk with a limp on cold days? He said you were wounded saving your unit. That's the official story. The truth is more complicated. Thomas turned to face his grandson. I missed a train because I lost my boots in the mud. Most ridiculous thing you ever heard. That train was bombed. 70% casualties. I spent the next year trying to justify my survival, taking increasingly desperate risks as if courage could retroactively earn me the right to live when others didn't. Ryan's eyes widened. You felt guilty for not dying? For a long time, yes. It made no sense that something as trivial as muddy boots determined who lived and who died. Thomas gestured around the cemetery. Wars like that. Random, chaotic, rarely heroic in the moment. Mostly it's frightened young men trying desperately not to let each other down. They walked slowly among the graves. I'm not telling you not to serve, Ryan. That's your decision. But do it with open eyes. The romantic notions, the glory, the adventure, they vanish in the first real firefight. What remains is duty to the person beside you. Thomas stopped walking. And if you go, remember this. Survival isn't something you earn or don't earn. Sometimes an arbitrary moment, a missed train, a lucky step, a random gust of wind makes all the difference. Ryan considered this. Then what's the point? If it's all just luck? The point comes after. Thomas placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. I've spent 57 years asking why I survived when others didn't. I finally realized I was asking the wrong question. What's the right question? Not why, but what for. Not why did I survive, but what did I do with the life I was given? Thomas looked into eyes that carried his bloodline into a future he would never see. Sometimes fate spares us not because we deserve it more than others, but because we have work yet to do, a family to raise, a child to save, a life to touch that will touch others in turn. We never know what ripples our existence creates. As they stood together among monuments to the fallen, Thomas recognized that his greatest legacy wasn't his silver star or the battles he'd survived. It was the living chain that extended through his children to Ryan and beyond, lives that would never have existed had he boarded that train in June 1944. For the first time, he felt not just acceptance of his survival, but profound gratitude for the mysterious mathematics of chance that had granted him these decades. The missed train hadn't been a mistake, but the beginning of everything that mattered.